Right now, you're surrounded by permanence, roads that don't disappear, power that comes back on, buildings that have stood for decades, some for centuries. It feels solid. It feels like it's always going to be here. But here's an unsettling question. What if that feeling is exactly what every civilization felt right before it wasn't true anymore? Because here's the thing nobody likes to think about. Every single society that ever collapsed thought it was permanent too. The people walking through the streets of Rome in its golden age weren't thinking, well, this is temporary. The farmers working the fields around the great Mayan cities weren't imagining their temples would one day sit empty, swallowed by jungle. The engineers and traders of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, moving bronze and tin and grain across an interconnected world, had no idea that within a single generation, nearly every major civilization around them would go dark almost simultaneously. Permanence is a feeling. It's not a guarantee. And once you start looking closely at history, you start noticing something strange. A pattern that shows up again and again in completely different times, completely different continents, completely different peoples who never had any contact with each other. Complex societies rise, they get more advanced, more interconnected, more impressive, and then, sometimes over centuries, sometimes shockingly fast, they come apart. Not always through fire and invasion, sometimes just through slow unraveling. Trade routes go quiet, cities empty out, writing systems get forgotten. Knowledge that took generations to build simply vanishes. Now, I want to be careful here, because this isn't about handing you a neat conspiracy or a tidy prophecy. We're not saying history definitely repeats on some cosmic schedule. What we're doing is something more interesting. We're going to walk through the actual evidence, the flood myths that show up on nearly every continent, the archaeological layers of ash and abandonment, the genetic and climate records, the strange gap in Göbekli Tepe's timeline, the eerie synchronized collapse of the Bronze Age world, and we're going to ask an honest question. Is there really one pattern connecting all of it? And if there is, what does that mean for us, sitting here in what might be, according to some ways of counting, the seventh great cycle of human civilization? That number 7 isn't something I'm going to just hand you and ask you to accept. We'll get into where that idea comes from, who proposed it, and how seriously historians and archaeologists actually take it. Some of it is solid evidence. Some of it is educated speculation. Some of it is genuinely mysterious. Part of the fun of this journey is learning to tell the difference. If you're listening to this late at night, drifting towards sleep, that's exactly what these are for. So tell me, where are you and what time is it right now? I love reading these in the morning and realizing someone was listening from Tokyo at 2 a.m. while someone else was listening from Toronto at dinner time. It's a strange, quiet kind of connection, all of us scattered across time zones, thinking about the same ancient questions before we fall asleep. Drop a comment with your city and your time. I read every single one. And if you enjoy this kind of long, slow journey through history, the best way to support what we're doing here is genuinely simple. Follow the show on Spotify, listen there if that's convenient for you, and if you find yourself enjoying it, leave a 5-star review. It barely takes a minute, but it makes a real difference for a small channel like this one. The link is right there in the description whenever you want it. Now, let's go back to the beginning, not of one civilization but of the whole troubling pattern itself. Let's start with a word we use constantly but rarely define, collapse. Because when most people hear that word, they picture something cinematic. Cities crumbling in a single night. Populations wiped out entirely. The last survivor wandering through empty streets. That's the Hollywood version. It's dramatic, it's satisfying, and it's almost never what actually happened. Real collapse is messier than that, and honestly more interesting. So before we go any further into this pattern, we keep noticing throughout history, we need to get precise about what we're actually talking about, because there are at least three very different things hiding under that one word, and mixing them up is how people end up believing wild theories that the evidence simply doesn't support. The first is what we might call a collapsed state. This is the most limited kind of failure. A political system, a government, a ruling dynasty, it falls apart. The people don't disappear. Their cities don't necessarily empty out. Their culture doesn't vanish. What collapses is the organizing structure at the top, the taxation system, the bureaucracy, the chain of command that held a large territory together as a single unit. Rome's Western Empire is the classic example. The city of Rome didn't get swallowed by the earth. People kept living there for centuries afterward. What disappeared was the empire, the administrative machine that had connected Britain to North Africa to the Middle East under one system of law and one system of coin. The second is a regional dark age, and this one is deeper. Here you're not just losing a government, you're losing entire layers of technology, literacy, and long-distance trade across a wide area for an extended period of time. Writing that had been common becomes rare or disappears entirely. Monumental architecture stops being built. Populations shrink and scatter into smaller, more isolated settlements. This is what happened in Greece after the Bronze Age collapse, a period so severe that linear B writing vanished for roughly 400 years. 4 centuries where an entire region simply forgot how to write. Not because everyone died, because the systems that supported literacy, the palace scribes, the administrative need for record-keeping, the trade networks that required it, all of that fell apart at once. And then there's the third category, the one this whole series keeps circling around. A global reset. This is the big one. A collapse severe enough and widespread enough that it doesn't just take down one region or one government, it disrupts complex civilization across much of the known world at roughly the same time. The Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE is the best documented candidate we have, when the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians, and half a dozen other interconnected powers all destabilized within a span of decades. Whether something like this happened before recorded history, further back than our written sources can reach, is a much harder question, and it's one we're going to spend a lot of time on. But notice something important already. Even the most extreme version of this, a genuine global reset, does not require humanity to nearly go extinct. It requires something much simpler and honestly much scarier. It requires the systems connecting people to break. This brings us to a point that's easy to miss but absolutely critical for understanding everything that follows. You do not need mass death for knowledge to disappear. You don't even need most of the population to die. You just need enough disruption to break the chain of transmission between one generation and the next. Think about how fragile that chain actually is. Complex knowledge, how to build an aqueduct, how to smelt bronze at the right temperature, how to navigate by the stars, how to write in a particular script, none of that lives in any single person's head in complete form. It lives distributed across specialists, apprentices, institutions, and practice. A master mason who trains 3 apprentices, one of whom trains 5 more. A scribe school that has operated continuously for 200 years. A guild of bronze workers who guard trade secrets about alloy ratios. If you break that chain even briefly, even for just one generation, the knowledge can be gone. Not because the information was destroyed exactly, but because there was nobody left who had actually learned how to do it, and nobody left to teach the ones who wanted to learn. This is exactly what seems to have happened with certain Bronze Age technologies. Some techniques used in that era for metalworking and construction weren't fully recovered for centuries, not because humans forgot they were possible in some abstract sense, but because the specific practical expertise, the muscle memory, the trial and error knowledge that only exists in trained hands, simply died with the people who held it and was never passed on. Now add population loss to this picture, because that's usually part of the story too, even if it's rarely total extinction. When cities empty out, when droughts or plagues or warfare push survivors to scatter into smaller communities, you don't just lose people. You lose density, and density is what makes specialization possible in the first place. A tiny farming village doesn't need a full-time scribe, a full-time bronze smith, a full-time architect. It needs generalists who can grow food, build shelter, and survive. So even if every single individual survives a crisis and simply migrates to smaller, safer settlements, the complex division of labour that made civilization look impressive in the first place can vanish almost overnight, because it was never really about the individuals. It was about the network they were embedded in. And that network, the trade routes moving tin from one region to copper in another, so bronze could be made at all, the sea lanes connecting palace economies that depended on grain shipments from hundreds of miles away, the diplomatic relationships that kept resources flowing smoothly between kingdoms, that network is often more fragile than any individual civilization within it. Break a handful of key links, a famine here, an invasion there, a volcanic eruption disrupting shipping lanes somewhere else, and the whole interconnected system can seize up, even if no single society within it was ever directly destroyed. So when we ask whether something like this happened before, further back than our history books can currently see, we have to be careful about what kind of evidence would actually prove it. This is where we need to draw a sharp line between solid archaeological evidence and modern reset narratives, the kind of speculative stories that circulate online promising a lost golden age civilization with technology beyond our own, wiped out and hidden from the record. Archaeological evidence looks like layers of ash in stratified soil, carbon-dated organic material, sudden gaps in pottery styles, abandoned cities with no signs of rebuilding for centuries, ice cores showing volcanic sulfur spikes that match written accounts of crop failures. It's slow, methodical, and often frustratingly incomplete. Reset narratives, by contrast, tend to start from a conclusion and work backward, cherry-picking anomalies while ignoring the much larger body of evidence that doesn't fit. Our job throughout this journey is to hold both of these possibilities in mind honestly. Genuine, unresolved mysteries do exist in the archaeological record, and we're going to explore several of them in detail. But mystery is not the same as proof, and an honest examination of history requires being comfortable with uncertainty rather than filling every gap with the most dramatic possible explanation. So here's how we're going to compare these events fairly as we move through history. For each collapse we examine, we'll ask the same core questions. How much of the population was actually lost, and how much simply relocated? Did writing, technology, or specialized knowledge disappear, and for how long? Did trade networks break down regionally, or across an entire interconnected world? And critically, is there direct physical evidence for this collapse, or are we relying on later legends, gaps in the record, and educated inference? Using this same framework consistently, comparing floods and droughts and invasions and plagues by the same honest standards, is how we're going to figure out whether there really is one pattern connecting all of it, or whether we're just pattern matching our way into a story that isn't really there. And that brings us to the central mechanism behind almost every collapse we're going to examine. Complexity. Not complexity in the vague sense, not just things got complicated. Complexity in the literal, physical, day-to-day sense. The system that lets a city exist at all, the invisible ladder of dependencies that lifts millions of people above bare survival. And the uncomfortable truth is that every rung of that ladder depends on the ones below it. Picture an ancient city at its height, maybe Babylon, maybe Rome, maybe a Maya capital rising above the jungle. Thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people living close together. Markets full of grain, workshops turning out pottery and cloth, temples staffed by priests, officials collecting taxes, builders repairing roads, scribes recording shipments, soldiers guarding gates. It looks solid, it looks permanent. Stone walls, paved streets, monumental buildings designed to make power feel eternal. But a city cannot feed itself. That is the first thing to understand. The bigger and more impressive a city becomes, the more dependent it is on land beyond its walls. Fields have to produce enough surplus food not only for farmers and their families, but for everybody who does not farm. The potter, the judge, the merchant, the priest, the soldier, the ruler, the child whose parents make bronze tools, the people cutting stone for monuments. Every one of them is alive because someone, somewhere, planted grain months earlier, protected it from pests, harvested it, stored it, and got it to market. And that process requires water, reliable water, rainfall in the right season, rivers that remain navigable, canals that do not clog with silt, wells that do not run dry. It requires transport, whether that means donkeys on rough tracks, carts on maintained roads, river barges, or ships crossing open seas. It requires energy, mostly in the ancient world, from human muscle, animal labour, wood, charcoal, wind, and flowing water. And it requires administration. Somebody has to organise the grain stores, settle disputes over land, maintain the canals, collect taxes to pay workers, and decide what happens when one district has a bad harvest while another has a surplus. A city is not just a collection of buildings. It is a machine made of people, materials, information, and routine. And unlike a stone wall, it does not stay standing simply because it was built once. It has to be rebuilt every day. This is why advanced societies can be both incredibly powerful and surprisingly fragile. Specialization gives them abilities no small village could match. When people do not all have to grow their own food, they can become experts. One person spends years learning how to make glass. Another learns to read legal documents. Another knows how to calculate the movement of stars. Another understands the precise temperatures needed to turn ore into metal. Another can design a bridge, organize a caravan, diagnose an illness, or manage a harbour. This is how civilization climbs, not because one generation suddenly becomes smarter than the last, but because knowledge accumulates. Each person can stand on work already done by others. But specialization comes with a trade-off. The more specialized a society becomes, the fewer people understand how the whole thing works. A farmer may know soil, seeds, weather, and livestock, but not how to forge an iron plough. The blacksmith may make the plough, but depend on distant miners for ore and charcoal burners for fuel. The miners may need tools shipped in from elsewhere. The shipbuilders need timber from forests they do not control. The officials organizing all of this may not know how to grow enough food if the tax system stops functioning. Everything works brilliantly, right up until one important link fails. This is not a criticism of civilization, it is the source of its strength. A society with division of labour can build aqueducts, libraries, fleets, temples, and cities. It can support astronomers and engineers. It can produce enough surplus to survive ordinary bad years. But it also creates dependencies that become invisible during stable times. People stop noticing the canal maintenance crews because the water keeps flowing. They stop thinking about the roads because the carts arrive. They stop worrying about food storage because the market has grain every morning. Then a drought hits, or war interrupts a trade route, or disease kills skilled workers faster than they can be replaced, or a government loses the ability to collect taxes outside its capital. Suddenly, the systems people took for granted begin failing one after another. And here is where collapses can accelerate. If irrigation canals are not cleared, silt builds up. Water reaches fewer fields, harvests decline. With less grain, governments collect less tax. With less tax, they cannot pay the workers who maintain canals, roads, granaries, or defensive walls. Farmers facing hunger abandon marginal land and move closer to safer areas. That means still fewer people are available to repair the system. A problem that began as a dry season can become an administrative crisis, then an economic crisis, then a political crisis. No single moment has to destroy the city. It can unravel because the work required to keep it alive is no longer being done. Rome offers a useful example, not because it vanished overnight, but because its infrastructure shows what maintenance really means. Roman roads, bridges, bathhouses, aqueducts, ports, and drainage systems were astonishing achievements. Some structures lasted for centuries after the empire that built them was gone. But surviving is not the same as functioning. An aqueduct needs channels cleared, leaks repaired, source areas protected, and skilled workers who know where the weak points are. A road needs drainage maintained, bridges rebuilt after floods, patrols to keep travel safe, and an economy active enough that people still have reason to move goods across it. When the tax base shrinks, institutions fragment, and long-distance trade declines. These systems do not necessarily explode. They simply become too expensive, too difficult, or too politically unimportant to maintain. A city that once imported food for hundreds of thousands may gradually become a much smaller place, surrounded by abandoned structures its remaining residents can no longer repair. This is the strange thing about ruins. They make the past look static. We see a broken aqueduct or a fallen temple and imagine that it was always destined to become a ruin. But when it was alive, it was part of a constant flow. Water moving, grain arriving, taxes recorded, workers paid, tools replaced, rules enforced. Remove the flow, and even the strongest stone becomes a shell. Now think about knowledge, because this is where the ladder becomes even more fragile. Writing seems permanent to us. Put words on clay, papyrus, parchment, paper, or stone, and surely they can outlast the people who wrote them. Sometimes they do, but writing alone is not enough. Somebody still needs to read the script. Somebody needs to understand the language. Somebody needs to know why the document matters and how the information inside it connects to real work. A warehouse tablet listing grain deliveries is useful only if there are officials capable of reading it, measuring grain, enforcing agreements, and organizing distribution. A manual describing metallurgy is not much help if nobody has access to ore, furnaces, tools, or the practical experience needed to interpret it. Technical knowledge is rarely a list of instructions. Much of it is embodied. It lives in hands, eyes, habits, and thousands of small judgments that are difficult to write down. That is why scribes, engineers, craftsmen, navigators, healers, architects, and master builders matter so much in the story of collapse. They are not just individual experts, they are living storage systems, and they need institutions around them to keep their knowledge alive. A scribe learns in a school, a bronze worker learns in a workshop. A mason learns beside a master, an administrator learns through years inside a functioning bureaucracy. If those schools close, workshops lose their supply chains, and bureaucracies stop paying wages, then the next generation may never receive the training. Within a few decades, a society can go from building something routinely to staring at its remains in confusion. We have direct evidence for versions of this happening. After the Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean, Linear B writing disappeared from Greece. The people did not disappear. Greek-speaking communities continued. But the palace-centered administrative world that had required and supported that script was gone. For centuries, writing was absent from the region. When literacy returned, it came through a different script, adapted from Phoenician models, serving a changed society. That is not proof of some lost super-civilization. It is something more grounded, and in its own way, more haunting. It shows that even writing, one of humanity's greatest inventions, can be lost when the institutions that make it useful collapse. Infrastructure works the same way. A city may inherit reservoirs, roads, docks, walls, and buildings from a richer age. For a while, survivors can use what remains. They can salvage stone, patch a roof, draw water from an old cistern. But every year, without full maintenance, narrows their options. Roofs leak, drainage channels clog, timber rots, metal corrodes. Bridges fail at their weakest point. A single generation may preserve a system imperfectly. 2 or 3 generations of disruption can leave behind structures that are still visible but no longer usable. This is why complexity is not a finish line. It is a condition that has to be renewed continuously. And it explains the pattern we are looking for. Again and again, civilizations do not fail because every person forgets everything. They fail because the connections that allow specialized knowledge, food, water, energy, transport, and authority to reinforce one another begin to break. Once that happens, societies often simplify. Cities shrink. Trade becomes local. People turn from specialized work toward the immediate needs of farming, defense, repair, and survival. From the outside, centuries later, that simplification can look like a reset. The monuments remain, the scattered descendants remain. But the ladder that made those monuments possible has lost too many rungs. So the question is not whether ancient people were somehow less capable than us. Clearly they were capable of extraordinary things. The real question is whether the systems supporting that capability could recognize danger before the failure became irreversible. Because collapses rarely begin with silence. Before the city's empty, before the writing disappears, before the roads go unused, there are usually warning signs. And once you know what to look for, they begin appearing almost everywhere. The warning signs are rarely mysterious. That is one of the most unsettling things about collapse. In hindsight, they can look almost obvious. The rains become less reliable. Harvests fail more often. Prices rise. Farmers fall into debt. Wealth concentrates in fewer hands. Political factions stop treating each other as rivals and start treating each other as enemies. Borders become harder to defend. Public works decay. Officials keep promising that the crisis is temporary. And for a while, they may even be right. A bad harvest does not destroy a civilization. Ancient societies were used to bad years. They stored grain, moved supplies, opened emergency reserves, reduced taxes, imported food, prayed for rain, and waited for the next season. A kingdom can survive one drought. It can survive a war. It can survive an epidemic. It can even survive a foolish ruler. What becomes dangerous is when several problems arrive together and when the solutions to one problem make another problem worse. Imagine a farming region that has enjoyed generations of good rainfall. Population grows, villages become towns, towns become cities. More land is brought under cultivation. Hillsides are cleared. Forests are cut for fuel, building materials, and farmland. Rulers demand more grain to feed soldiers, labourers, temple staffs, and people in the capital. This works as long as the harvests keep coming. Then the weather shifts. Not necessarily into some instant apocalyptic desert. More often rainfall becomes erratic. The wet season arrives late. A river floods at the wrong time. One year is dry. The next year brings storms that wash away topsoil. Then another dry year follows before the fields can recover. Crops still grow, but not enough. Granaries are still filled, but not as fully. The market still operates, but prices start climbing. At first, the people with power may barely notice. The palace still receives its taxes, the elite still attend feasts. Temples still collect offerings, monuments are still built, sometimes precisely because rulers want to prove that they remain in control. A civilization can look magnificent at the exact moment its foundations are weakening. This is one reason archaeology can be so deceptive. We find a final burst of construction, richer tombs, larger palaces, more elaborate inscriptions, and it is tempting to assume the society was flourishing until the end. But sometimes the opposite may be true. Grand building projects can be attempts to hold together a political order under strain. They can employ hungry workers, display royal power, reassure allies, intimidate enemies, or declare that the gods still favour the ruling class. The stone is real, the wealth is real, but neither tells us how close ordinary people may have been to the edge. Because instability is not experienced equally. For elites, the early stages of crisis can be inconvenient. For farmers, labourers, and the urban poor, they can be catastrophic. A ruler may respond to falling revenue by raising taxes. From the capital, this can look like necessity. Soldiers need payment. Fortifications need repair. Grain reserves need replenishing. Officials need to be kept loyal. But for a farming family already dealing with a poor harvest, one extra demand can mean selling livestock, borrowing seed grain, pawning land, or sending children away to relatives because there is not enough food. Debt becomes especially dangerous in these moments. In many ancient societies, debt was not just a number written on a tablet. It could mean the loss of land, labour obligations, or dependence on a wealthy creditor. A farmer who loses his field may become a tenant. A tenant who cannot pay may flee. And when enough farmers flee, the state loses the very people who produce its food and taxes. This creates a vicious circle. Less grain means less revenue. Less revenue means greater pressure on those still producing. Greater pressure pushes more people into debt, migration, rebellion, or banditry. The government responds with force, but force costs money. Every attempt to stabilize the system consumes resources the system is already struggling to provide. And meanwhile, inequality grows. This does not mean inequality alone automatically causes collapse. Human societies have endured enormous inequalities for long periods. But in a time of stress, inequality changes the way a crisis moves through the population. If a small elite controls land, stored food, credit, and political power, they may be able to protect themselves for years. They can buy grain when prices rise. They can move to safer estates. They can use guards, connections, and influence. Everyone else has fewer choices. The result is not just suffering, it is a loss of trust. Why should a village send grain to the capital if its own children are hungry? Why should soldiers defend a ruler who cannot pay them? Why should provincial officials obey orders from a distant court that offers demands but no protection? Why should rival factions compromise when every concession feels like a death sentence? This is where political conflict becomes more than palace drama. In stable times, a society can absorb bad leadership. Institutions can correct mistakes. Councils meet. Laws are enforced. Tax collectors do their work. Local leaders negotiate with central authorities. But under pressure, these institutions begin to turn inward. Offices become prizes to be captured. Armies become loyal to individual commanders. Court factions sabotage each other. Regional governors keep taxes for themselves because they no longer trust the centre to protect them. The state may still exist on paper. It may still issue decrees. It may still mint coins, build walls, appoint officials, and claim control over vast territories. But its real power is becoming uneven. Orders travel outward and are ignored. Taxes are demanded but do not arrive. Garrisons remain listed in official records even after their soldiers have deserted, died, or gone unpaid. Roads are technically imperial roads, but merchants no longer consider them safe. The map stays the same longer than reality does. That is another recurring pattern. Institutions often appear strongest shortly before they fail, because they are still performing the rituals of strength. The court holds ceremonies. The ruler adopts grand titles. New laws are proclaimed. Enemies are blamed. Statistics are adjusted. Officials announce that order has been restored. And sometimes order really is restored, at least temporarily. History is full of societies that recovered from terrifying crises. But recovery requires more than confidence. It requires reserves. It requires trust. It requires enough food, enough labour, enough functioning institutions, and enough shared belief that cooperation is still worth the cost. When those reserves are gone, gradual danger becomes hard to reverse. This is why societies so often misread the approach of collapse. Human beings are adapted to immediate threats: a fire, an invading army, a flood sweeping through the streets. Those dangers are visible. They demand action. But a slow decline in rainfall is easy to explain away. A little more debt can be postponed. A little more corruption can be tolerated. A little more political violence can be framed as an exception. Each year feels survivable because each year by itself is survivable, and that is the trap. No one wakes up and says, "Today our civilization begins to end." They say the next harvest will be better, the rebels will be defeated, the trade route will reopen, the new ruler will restore confidence. The gods will send rain. The old arrangement has survived worse. Sometimes it has, but sometimes the society has quietly crossed a threshold. The reservoirs are too low. The farmers have left. The treasury is empty. The skilled workers are gone. The political factions can no longer cooperate. The emergency grain has already been eaten. What looked like a temporary crisis was actually the point where the system lost its ability to recover. Then the dramatic events arrive. A city is sacked. A dynasty falls. A migration turns violent. A drought becomes famine. An epidemic moves through a population weakened by hunger. Later generations remember the dramatic moment because it is easier to tell as a story. But the fall usually began much earlier. It began in the fields, in the loans, in the empty storehouses, in the arguments nobody could settle, and in the small warnings that powerful people could afford not to see. And across the ancient world, perhaps nowhere, are those warnings remembered more vividly than in stories of water. Great floods, rising seas, cities swallowed by the waves. Memories that may preserve echoes of real disasters, transformed over generations into myths about a world that was lost. Water is different from drought. A drought gives warnings. The fields weaken, the wells fall, people argue over what remains. But a flood can turn a familiar world into a stranger in a single night. A river that has fed a city for centuries rises over its banks. Walls collapse, grain stores dissolve into mud, houses disappear. Families are separated in darkness. By morning the roads are gone, the boundaries are gone, and the landscape itself seems to have been rewritten. It is not surprising that flood stories appear almost everywhere. In ancient Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates could nourish enormous populations, but also flood with terrifying violence, there was the story of Atrahasis. The gods decide that humanity has become too numerous, too noisy, too difficult to tolerate. A great flood is sent to wipe them out, but one man receives a warning. He builds a boat, preserves life, survives the waters, and offers a sacrifice when the land finally reappears. A version of this same basic story appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh. There the survivor is called Utnapishtim. He tells Gilgamesh about a world-ending deluge, a sealed vessel, animals taken aboard, days of storm, and a bird released to search for dry land. Later, in the Hebrew Bible, Noah receives a warning from God, builds an ark, gathers animals, and survives a flood that destroys the corrupt world outside. The similarities with the older Mesopotamian traditions are difficult to ignore. These stories emerged from neighbouring cultures, moving through a region where rivers were both the source of life and a constant threat to it. Greece had Deucalion and Pyrrha, survivors of a flood sent by Zeus. In India there was Manu, warned by a fish that a great flood was coming. Manu builds a vessel, survives, and becomes an ancestor of renewed humanity. And beyond the written traditions of Eurasia, flood stories are found among many indigenous peoples across the Americas, Australia, the Pacific, and other regions. Some tell of rising waters that covered the land. Some tell of ancestors escaping to mountains or boats. Some tell of animals helping humans survive. Some tell of the world being remade after a great inundation. That pattern can feel almost impossible to dismiss. So was there one universal flood, one global catastrophe remembered by every culture on Earth. The evidence does not support that conclusion. There is no accepted geological evidence for a single flood. Within the period of human civilization that covered the entire planet and destroyed all land at once. Mountains contain soils, caves preserve long records of occupation, and ancient settlements exist in many regions across the periods when different flood traditions may have formed. The Earth has seen enormous floods, certainly, but not one recent worldwide event that matches every later story in a literal way. And in a strange way that may make the stories more revealing, not less. Human beings tend to settle near water. Rivers provide drinking water, fish, fertile soil, transportation, and trade. Coasts offer food, harbours, and access to the wider world. But these are also the places most exposed to flooding. A civilization that depends on a river lives with the knowledge that the river can become an enemy. In Mesopotamia, a major river flood could destroy several settlements across a broad plain. In Egypt, the Nile's yearly flood was usually predictable and life-giving, but irregular floods could still bring disaster. In China, the Yellow River changed course repeatedly across history, leaving devastation on a scale difficult to imagine. In South Asia, monsoon rains, cyclones, river floods and storm surges could transform entire regions. For the people living through one of these events, the flood did not need to cover the whole earth. It only needed to cover their earth. If every village you know is underwater, if the fields that fed your family are gone, if the temple, market, graveyard and road have vanished beneath brown water, then the old world has ended. The fact that people somewhere beyond the horizon survived does not make the catastrophe feel any smaller. And rivers were only part of the story. Tsunamis could be worse. A distant earthquake under the sea can send walls of water racing across an ocean. The first sign may be the sea pulling back from shore, exposing fish and seabed where water should be. Then, minutes later, the water returns with a force capable of carrying ships inland, smashing houses, uprooting forests, and killing thousands of people who have no idea what is happening. Ancient coastal communities had no warning systems. No satellites, no emergency broadcasts, no maps showing the wave moving toward them. A tsunami would have arrived like the anger of a god, sudden, incomprehensible, and total. Then there was the slowest flood of all, sea level rise after the last ice age. At the peak of the ice age, so much water was locked in vast glaciers that sea level was more than 100 meters lower than it is today. Coastlines extended far beyond their modern positions. Areas now beneath the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indonesian seas, and the waters between Asia and Australia were once dry land. Some were grasslands, river valleys, marshes, hunting grounds, and possible homes for human communities. Then the ice melted, not in one day, not as a single global wave. Over thousands of years the oceans rose, sometimes gradually, sometimes in faster pulses as massive ice sheets destabilized. The shoreline moved inland generation by generation. A camp near the coast became a camp beside an inlet. The inlet became a bay. The bay became open sea. For people whose ancestors had hunted on those plains, this was not an abstract climate process. It was the disappearance of territory. Oral traditions may preserve echoes of such changes. This is difficult to prove in any individual case. Stories change. They absorb symbolism, morality, religion, and the concerns of later generations. But researchers have noted that some indigenous Australian traditions describe coastlines and islands in ways that may reflect ancient sea level rise. If even a few such traditions contain memories passed down across millennia, they would show something remarkable. Human communities can carry environmental knowledge far longer than written history. Not perfectly, not like a photograph, more like a dream that keeps one true shape even as every generation adds new details. A plain becomes a drowned kingdom, a storm becomes divine judgment. A survivor becomes a chosen ancestor. The boat becomes an ark. The flood becomes not just a disaster, but a lesson about pride, violence, imbalance, or failure to listen to warnings. That is why flood myths matter to the story of collapse. They are not necessarily evidence that one advanced global civilization was erased by a single wave. But they are evidence of something more basic and more universal. Humans have repeatedly experienced the loss of worlds they thought were permanent. The river changed course. The sea took the coast. The land that had always been there was suddenly gone. And for survivors, the question was not whether the world had literally ended. It was whether the old world could ever be found again, because beneath many flood stories lies the same terrifying realization. Civilization is built on landscapes that do not promise to stay still. And after the Ice Age, as seas rose over immense areas of once habitable land, whole human worlds may have vanished beneath the water, leaving behind little more than stories, fragments, and shorelines we can no longer see. And that brings us to one of the most unsettling facts about the human past. The oldest coastlines we know are not the coastlines where many ancient people actually lived. They are the coastlines left behind after the ocean finished moving. At the height of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, the planet looked familiar from far away, but the map was different. So much water had been locked into glaciers, ice sheets sometimes miles thick, that global sea level stood around 120 meters lower than it does today. That is almost 400 feet. An enormous amount of land now hidden beneath shallow seas was exposed to the air. The North Sea was not a sea. Between Britain and mainland Europe lay a broad region of plains, rivers, lakes, marshes and low hills. Archaeologists call it Doggerland. For thousands of years it connected what are now separate islands and countries. Herds moved across it, rivers flowed through it, human groups almost certainly hunted, gathered, camped, traded, raised children, buried their dead and told stories there. Then the water came back, not as one cinematic wall sweeping across Europe in an afternoon. Mostly it rose slowly enough that a single person might not notice the full scale of the change. But a family living in the same region for 10 generations would. The old hunting ground near the river became marsh. The marsh became tidal flats. The tidal flats became open water. A familiar landmark vanished, then another, then the route to a neighbouring group required a boat. Eventually, Britain became an island, and Doggerland disappeared beneath the North Sea. The same thing happened across much of the world. Southeast Asia was once connected by vast lowlands called Sunderland. Modern Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand and Borneo were part of a much larger exposed landscape threaded with rivers. The Persian Gulf, now a shallow arm of the sea, may once have contained a broad basin with freshwater sources and habitable terrain. The land bridge between Siberia and Alaska, Beringia, connected Asia and North America. In many places, the Ice Age coastline lay hundreds of miles beyond the shoreline we see today. This matters because coasts are where people tend to live. They are rich environments. Fish, shellfish, seabirds, seals, seaweed, fresh water from rivers, transport routes, sheltered bays, and access to inland resources. A coastal community does not need to be technologically advanced to become stable, organised, and relatively numerous. Even hunter-gatherers can build deep knowledge of seasonal tides, fish runs, migration routes, plant cycles, and local weather. Given enough time, such knowledge becomes a way of life, a culture, a network of communities tied to a particular landscape. And then that landscape can vanish. The end of the Ice Age was not one smooth, gentle warming trend. It was a period of dramatic climatic instability. Temperatures rose overall, but not evenly. Ice sheets retreated, sometimes paused, sometimes surged into collapse. Ocean circulation changed, rainfall belts shifted, rivers swelled or dried, ecosystems reorganized, animals migrated into new territories or disappeared from old ones. For humans, this meant that the world did not merely get warmer. It became unpredictable. Around 14,600 years ago, during a period scientists call meltwater pulse 1A, global sea levels appear to have risen very rapidly by geological standards. The exact speed is still debated. Researchers argue over how much rise occurred, how long it lasted, and which collapsing ice sheets contributed most. But the central point is widely accepted. There were times when sea level rise accelerated sharply, perhaps by several meters, within only a few centuries. That may sound slow. It is not slow if you live on a flat coastal plain. A few meters of rising water can push the shoreline miles inland. It can turn a river valley into an estuary. Salt can move into farmland and freshwater wetlands. Storm surges can reach places that had never flooded before. Communities may be forced to relocate again and again, abandoning camps, sacred sites, storage pits, and graves. And in certain regions, the experience could have been much faster still. Global sea level rises over centuries. Local flooding can happen in days. A storm driven by a new higher sea can overrun low ground. A river backed up by encroaching tides can flood farther inland. An earthquake can trigger a tsunami. A collapsing ice dam can unleash a catastrophic outburst flood. In the North Sea region, long after much of Doggerland had already been reduced by rising water, the Storegga slide off the coast of Norway generated a massive tsunami around 8,200 years ago. Waves struck parts of the remaining lowlands. For communities still living there, it may have felt like the final destruction of a world already shrinking generation by generation. This is where the idea of drowned landscapes becomes so important. If ancient communities lived on land that is now underwater, then their settlements are not absent because they never existed. They are absent because we have not reached them yet. Archaeology is already difficult on dry land. Most ancient homes were built of wood, reeds, mud, hide, and other materials that decay quickly. Shorelines make preservation even worse. waves erode. Currents scatter artifacts, sediment buries sites. Rising seas can destroy a settlement, then cover what remains beneath dozens of meters of water. Finding these places requires specialized underwater surveys, sonar mapping, sediment cores, divers, remotely operated vehicles, and a great deal of patience. And even then, researchers are searching an immense area. The continental shelves of the world contain millions of square kilometers of former land. Much of it has barely been examined. Still, barely examined does not mean completely unknowable. Evidence is beginning to emerge. Stone tools have been recovered from submerged landscapes. Ancient river channels can be mapped beneath the North Sea. Underwater excavations have found traces of early settlements and fishing communities in places from the Mediterranean to the Baltic. Along some coasts, preserved wood, footprints, hearths, and shell middens reveal that people were living near waters very different from those of today. But the evidence we have so far does not show a lost Ice Age global civilization with cities, writing, metal industries, or machines. That distinction matters. Drowned landscapes make it entirely reasonable to say that our picture of early human life is incomplete. They make it likely that many coastal settlements have been erased or remain beyond our reach. They may eventually reveal societies more complex, more connected, and more inventive than older textbooks imagined. But they do not automatically prove that an advanced civilization existed before known history. A missing record is not the same thing as evidence for any particular thing missing from it. If a civilization on the scale of Egypt, Mesopotamia, or Rome had existed before the seas rose, we might expect at least some traces beyond the drowned coastlines. Mining sites, quarries, inland roads, distinctive tools, large-scale changes to forests and soils, widespread artifacts carried by trade, geological signatures of intensive industry. So far, nothing securely dated to the end of the Ice Age has provided that kind of proof. What the drowned world gives us is something subtler, and perhaps more troubling. It shows that the archive of human history has holes in it. Not small holes, entire landscapes. Places where people may have lived for thousands of years are now under the North Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Black Sea margins, the Sunda Shelf, and countless other submerged plains. Their names are gone. Their stories are gone. Their houses are gone. And in some cases, the very ground they stood on no longer appears on ordinary maps. That does not mean they were a forgotten high-tech civilization, but it does mean that civilization, memory, and evidence are more fragile than we like to believe. The ocean did not need to destroy every human society to create the feeling of a reset. It only had to erase the places where people had built their lives. And sometimes the missing pieces do not lie beneath the sea. Sometimes they are sitting on a hill in southeastern Turkey, buried deliberately under tons of earth, waiting more than 11,000 years for someone to notice what they mean. Göbekli Tepe is one of those places. Its name means Potbelly Hill. For a long time, it looked like little more than an artificial rise in the landscape. Then excavations began revealing something extraordinary beneath it. Massive stone pillars, some over 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, arranged in circular and oval enclosures. The pillars were carved into T-shapes with arms, hands, belts, and animal figures etched into their surfaces. Foxes, snakes, wild boar, birds, scorpions, predators with teeth bared. Creatures moving across the stone as if they belonged to a symbolic world we can only partly understand. And the date was the real shock. Some of the earliest layers at Göbekli Tepe were built around 9,600 BCE. That is roughly 11,600 years ago, before pottery, before metal, before the wheel, before writing, before cities, and, according to the old version of the story, before people had settled down to farm. For generations, the standard model of civilization seemed straightforward. First came agriculture. People planted crops and domesticated animals. Food surpluses allowed populations to grow. Permanent villages appeared. Villages became towns. Towns created social hierarchies, organized labor, priesthoods, rulers, temples, and eventually states. Farming came first. Monuments came later. Göbekli Tepe made that story much harder to tell. Here were monumental stone structures built by people living at the very beginning of the transition from hunting and gathering to farming. These were not crude piles of rock. The builders quarried limestone-shaped pillars with stone tools, transported them, placed them upright, and arranged them in carefully designed enclosures. That required planning, skilled labour, shared rules, enough food to support workers while they were not gathering or hunting, and some powerful reason to make hundreds of people cooperate, because moving a pillar weighing several tons is not a casual afternoon project. It means people had to come together, maybe seasonally, maybe from several different settlements, maybe through networks of kinship, exchange, marriage, and shared ritual. They needed people to cut stone, haul it, prepare food, maintain order, and pass down knowledge of how the whole operation worked. No king's palace has been found at Göbekli Tepe. No written orders survive. No clear evidence identifies a ruling class directing the work. But organization was clearly there. This is the problem of beginnings. Göbekli Tepe does not prove that civilization appeared suddenly from nowhere. It does not mean hunter-gatherers secretly built an advanced empire that vanished without a trace. But it does show that the line between simple nomads and complex civilization was never as clean as older textbooks made it seem. Human beings were capable of large-scale cooperation long before cities, and perhaps ritual helped make that cooperation possible. Many archaeologists interpret Göbekli Tepe as a ritual gathering place, though the exact purpose remains debated. The great enclosures do not look like ordinary houses. Their pillars appear to have symbolic importance. Animal imagery may have represented dangers, myths, clan identities, spiritual beings, or ideas we no longer have the cultural key to decode. Human-like pillars standing in circles may have represented ancestors, powerful figures, or something else entirely. We do not know. That uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. People often imagine ancient religion as something that appeared after basic survival had been solved. First food, then shelter, then gods. But sites like Göbekli Tepe suggest the relationship may have run both ways. Shared beliefs may have helped people organize food, labor, exchange, and settlement. A gathering for ritual could become a gathering for feasting. A gathering for feasting could require reliable supplies of grain and meat. Reliable supplies could encourage people to manage wild plants, protect useful landscapes, and remain near a place longer each year. In other words, people may not have settled down only because they invented farming. They may have begun farming in part because gathering together had become important. Around Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists have found evidence of early communities experimenting with cultivation and eventually domestication. The region lies within the Fertile Crescent, where wild wheat, barley, and other useful plants grew naturally. Nearby sites show that people were building more permanent settlements during this broader period. The change was not instant. It was not one brilliant invention that transformed everyone overnight. It was a long negotiation between people and landscape. For thousands of years, communities may have moved back and forth along a spectrum, hunting wild animals, gathering wild cereals, staying in one place longer, building storage facilities, returning to familiar sites, planting or tending useful species, slowly changing their own lives while changing the plants and animals around them. Göbekli Tepe stands near the beginning of that transformation. And then there is another strange detail. At some point, many of its enclosures were intentionally filled in, not simply abandoned and covered by wind-blown soil. Buried, stone fragments, earth, animal bone and debris were packed around the pillars until the structures disappeared beneath an artificial mound. Later people built new enclosures above the older ones. Then those too were covered. Why bury something that took so much work to create? Perhaps the site's meaning changed. Perhaps old ritual spaces had to be closed properly before new ones could be built. Perhaps communities moved, reorganized, or lost the social networks needed to maintain the monuments. Maybe the burial itself was part of the ritual. Again, we do not know. But the image is difficult to forget. A people capable of raising huge stone circles, then deliberately sealing them away. Not because the site had never mattered, but perhaps because it mattered too much to leave open. This is where Göbekli Tepe can tempt us into exaggeration. Its pillars are impressive, its age is astonishing. Its builders remain partly mysterious, and whenever archaeology reveals something unexpected, there is a rush to fill the gaps with the biggest possible story. Lost super-civilizations, forgotten engineers, survivors from an earlier world, ancient machines or secret knowledge, but none of that is required by the evidence. The people of Göbekli Tepe had stone tools, local materials, human labour, remarkable skill and time. They did not need lasers, aliens, or inherited high technology to shape limestone. Experimental archaeology has shown that stone can be quarried, carved, and moved with simple tools, ropes, timber, coordinated effort, and enough people. Difficult does not mean impossible. Monumental does not automatically mean technologically advanced in the modern sense. What it means is that our ancestors were more socially capable than we once assumed. That is already profound enough. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that prehistory is not an empty hallway leading towards civilization. It is full of rooms we have barely opened. Societies without writing could still preserve complex knowledge. Communities without cities could still mobilize labor on an enormous scale. Ritual, memory, craftsmanship, and cooperation could produce structures that outlasted the people who made them by more than 100 centuries. And if one hill in one region can overturn such confident assumptions, then how many other beginnings are still hidden, under modern towns, beneath fields, in deserts, in forests, and, as we have already seen, under the rising seas? The past is not necessarily stranger because it contained a vanished global civilization. It is stranger because human complexity began earlier, took more forms, and left a more fragmentary record than we were taught to expect. And that fragmentation matters, because when we turn to the first civilizations with cities, kings, armies, trade routes, and written records, we find that even they were never as permanent as they believed. The next great collapse would not bury a few stone circles on a hill. It would darken an entire interconnected world. For centuries, the kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean had been building something that looked almost permanent. Egypt ruled the Nile Valley under pharaohs whose names were carved into stone. The Mycenaean kingdoms of Greece built fortified palaces at places like Mycenae, Pylos, and Tiryns in central Anatolia. The Hittite Empire ruled from its capital at Hattusa, commanding armies, treaties, and vast territories. Cyprus supplied copper. The cities of the Levant moved cedar, purple dye, glass, grain, oil, wine, ivory, timber and luxury goods from one shore to another. And between them ran a web. Ships crossed the Mediterranean, loaded with raw materials and finished goods. Merchants carried messages between royal courts. Diplomatic marriages linked dynasties. Scribes recorded deliveries, taxes, labour assignments. land holdings, and military supplies on clay tablets. Kings exchanged gifts of gold, horses, weapons, and princesses, calling one another brother in letters that travelled across deserts and seas. This was not one empire. It was something more fragile. A system of powerful states, each dependent on the others in ways they may not have fully understood. The Mycenaean palaces needed copper from Cyprus and tin from distant sources to make bronze. Bronze meant tools, weapons, armour, prestige. Egypt depended on trade and tribute flowing through the Levant. The Hittites needed access to grain, metals, roads, ports, and subject kingdoms. Small city-states survived by placing themselves inside the currents of exchange between larger powers. It was an international age, and then around 1200 BCE, much of it went dark. Not in a single night, not from one single cause. The Bronze Age collapse unfolded over decades, perhaps generations, differently in different places. But the overall pattern is hard to miss. Palaces burned. Cities were abandoned or destroyed, trade routes failed. Kingdoms that had existed for centuries vanished from the map. At Pylos in Greece, scribes were still writing tablets in Linear B, the script used by Mycenaean palace administrations, when the palace was destroyed around 1180 BCE. The final records seem almost painfully ordinary. Inventories, workers, preparations, possible concerns over coastal defence. Then the tablets stop. The palace burned. The bureaucracy disappeared. And with it disappeared the ability to write Linear B. For centuries afterward, Greece entered a period with almost no surviving written records at all. Think about that. A society with palaces, accountants, armies, specialised craftspeople, and international trade did not merely lose a king or suffer a military defeat. It lost the institutions that made its complexity possible. The scribes were gone. The archives were gone. The redistributive system that gathered food and goods into palace storehouses was gone. Knowledge once preserved in administration had nowhere to live. The Hittite Empire suffered an even more dramatic end. Hattusa, one of the great capitals of the ancient world, was abandoned and destroyed around this same turbulent era. Its imperial network broke apart. The Hittites had negotiated with Egypt as equals. They had fought massive battles, controlled strategic routes, and maintained written archives on a scale that lets us glimpse the machinery of their state. Then the machinery stopped. Egypt survived, but not untouched. Inscriptions from the reign of Ramesses III describe attacks by groups the Egyptians called the Sea Peoples. These were likely not one unified nation sailing out of the mist, but a shifting collection of migrants, raiders, displaced communities, and military groups moving through a region already under enormous strain. Egypt repelled some attacks, but even Egypt could not restore the older world. The old order was ending, so what happened? For a long time, people wanted one answer: the Sea Peoples, an invasion, a great war, a natural disaster. But the evidence points towards something more unsettling. Several disasters may have arrived at once. Climate records suggest that parts of the eastern Mediterranean experienced periods of drought around the end of the late Bronze Age. Drought does not just mean less rain, it means poor harvests. Poor harvests mean hunger. Hunger means migration, unrest, unpaid workers, weakened armies and rulers struggling to feed cities that had become dependent on centralized supplies. Earthquakes may have damaged some settlements. Warfare clearly occurred. Some cities show signs of burning and violent destruction. Internal rebellions may have shaken palace systems from below. Trade disruptions made it harder to replace lost resources. Migrating groups put pressure on borders already weakened by famine and conflict. Any one of these problems might have been survivable. That is the point. The Bronze Age world was not destroyed because it was simple. It was destroyed, at least in part, because it had become extraordinarily connected. A drought in one region could reduce grain shipments somewhere else. A disrupted port could halt the flow of copper. Without copper and tin, bronze production suffered. Without bronze, armies and agricultural tools became harder to equip. A weakened kingdom could no longer protect roads. Then trade became even more dangerous. Then neighbouring kingdoms lost supplies. Then more people moved. More local rulers rebelled. More cities fortified themselves or fell. It was a chain reaction, like a row of lamps connected to the same failing wire. One goes out, then another flickers, then suddenly the whole room is dark. This does not mean every city vanished. Some places adapted. Some communities moved inland. Some smaller settlements may even have benefited when palace control weakened. Egypt endured. Phoenician cities later became important maritime powers. New societies emerged from the wreckage. But the old system did not recover. The palatial world of the late Bronze Age, with its kings, scribes, fleets, treaties, workshops and long-distance supply chains, had undergone something close to a civilizational reset. Not humanity starting from zero. People still knew how to farm, build, sail, fight, weave, and tell stories. They carried memories forward, but the scale of organization had collapsed. Networks shrank. Literacy narrowed or disappeared in some regions. Monumental centers lost their power. For generations, people lived among the ruins of a world their grandparents may have believed would last forever. And this is why the Bronze Age collapse matters so much. It gives us one of history's clearest warnings that complexity is not the same thing as security. Sometimes the very connections that make a civilization rich, efficient, and powerful can also make its failures travel farther than anyone expects. And the pattern did not belong only to the ancient Mediterranean. Across the ocean, in the tropical lowlands of Mesoamerica, another world of cities rose, flourished, fought, and then changed so dramatically that later visitors imagined an entire people had disappeared into the jungle. They had not, but for a long time, the ruins made it feel that way. Imagine arriving in the forests of Guatemala, Belize, southern Mexico, or western Honduras, and finding stone pyramids rising through the trees, staircases buried beneath roots, palaces with collapsed roofs, carved monuments standing in silent plazas, their inscriptions recording kings, wars, marriages, victories, captures and ceremonies. Places like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, Caracol, Dos, Pylos, Yaxchilan. These were not isolated temples built by a mysterious vanished race. They were the centers of one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the ancient Americas. During what archaeologists call the Classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, Maya city-states developed writing, mathematics, astronomy, monumental architecture, intensive agriculture, and complex systems of political power. They tracked time with astonishing precision. They used a mathematical symbol for 0 centuries before it appeared in Europe. They carved historical records into stone, naming rulers and dating events with a calendar so exact that modern scholars can often identify the day a king came to power more than 1,000 years ago. But the Maya were never one unified empire. That matters. The Maya world was a patchwork of rival kingdoms, each centered on a city, each ruled by dynasties competing for prestige, tribute, territory, labor, and captives. Tikal and Calakmul spent generations locked in a struggle for influence across the lowlands. Smaller kingdoms shifted alliances, rebelled, submitted, changed sides, and sometimes disappeared from the written record after military defeat. It was a civilization connected by language, religion, trade, art, and shared traditions. But politically it was divided, and in the 8th and 9th centuries many of the great cities of the southern lowlands began to fail. The clues are written in stone. Maya rulers had a habit of raising carved monuments called stelae. These stones recorded royal anniversaries, accessions, wars, rituals, and claims to legitimacy. For centuries, new monuments appeared with remarkable regularity. Kings wanted everyone to know they were still in power, still performing ceremonies, still commanding armies, still connected to the gods and the cycles of time. Then, in many cities, the dates stop. At one site after another, the final monuments appear in the late 8th or 9th century. Dynasties vanish from the inscriptions, palaces cease to be maintained, building projects end, populations decline, royal courts that had commanded thousands of workers lose the ability to organize even the basic labor needed to preserve their centers. It was not one moment, not one final battle, and not every Maya city experienced it at the same time. But something was breaking across the system. One major factor appears to have been drought. Scientists studying lake sediments, cave formations, and other climate records have found evidence for repeated periods of reduced rainfall in parts of the Maya region during the centuries of decline. Some of the most severe dry intervals seem to overlap with the collapse of political authority in the southern lowlands, especially during the 9th century. And in a tropical civilization dependent on seasonal rain, drought could become a political disaster almost immediately. The Maya did not simply farm wherever the soil looked green. They engineered landscapes. They built terraces, raised fields, reservoirs, canals, and water storage systems. They drained wetlands in some places and captured rainwater in others. Their cities supported dense populations in regions where rivers were often seasonal and where dry season water could become dangerously scarce. This was an extraordinary achievement, but it also created vulnerability. A few weak rainy seasons could reduce harvests. Repeated drought could empty reservoirs, damage maize production, and place unbearable pressure on cities already supporting nobles, priests, soldiers, craftspeople, labourers, and large populations dependent on centralised food supplies. And drought was not acting alone. By the late Classic period, warfare between Maya kingdoms had intensified. Inscriptions increasingly describe attacks, defeats, burned places, captured rulers, and political humiliation. A king who could not protect his people, secure water, win wars, or conduct the rituals expected of him was not merely seen as unlucky. His entire claim to rule could begin to collapse. Think about the trap. Less rain means less food means unrest. Unrest weakens rulers, weak rulers invite attacks. War disrupts farming and trade. Disrupted farming creates even less food. Then people begin leaving, not because they have forgotten how to be Maya, not because the jungle has swallowed them overnight, but because the city, the dynasty, and the system that once organized their lives no longer provides security. Environmental pressure may have been made worse in some areas by deforestation, soil erosion, and the expansion of farmland. Large cities needed timber for buildings, fuel, and lime plaster. Intensive agriculture could strain local landscapes. Scholars still debate how much environmental degradation contributed in different regions. The evidence is not identical everywhere, but the broader picture is clear enough. The Maya collapse was not caused by a single thing. It was a cascade: drought, warfare, fragmenting alliances, agricultural strain, population movement, political failure, each problem making the others harder to solve. And yet this is where the word collapse can mislead us. The Maya did not vanish. Millions of Maya people survived. They moved. They adapted, they reorganized their communities. Some northern centers, including places in the Yucatan Peninsula, remained important or rose afterward. Maya kingdoms continued into the period of Spanish invasion. Maya languages are still spoken today by millions of people across Mexico and Central America. Maya communities still preserve traditions, identities, knowledge, and connections to a past far deeper than the ruins tourists visit. What collapsed was not the Maya people. What collapsed in many regions was a particular form of Maya civilization. The densely populated southern lowland city-state system ruled by divine kings, sustained by intensive agriculture, ceremonial authority, and rival dynasties competing across a fragile landscape. That distinction is everything. A civilization can lose its greatest cities without losing its people. It can lose writing in one place, political unity in another, trade routes somewhere else, and still carry its memory forward in villages, languages, families, rituals, and stories. The stone cities fell quiet, but the Maya did not, and their story reveals something uncomfortable about the word reset. A reset does not always look like total extinction. Sometimes it looks like abandoned capitals, broken dynasties, empty plazas, and survivors building new lives beyond the reach of the old system. The people remain. The old arrangement does not. And perhaps no civilization has been misunderstood more often through the language of collapse than Rome. Ask someone when Rome fell, and they may give you a date. 476 CE. That was the year a Germanic military leader named Odoacer removed the last Western emperor, a teenage boy with a grand name Romulus Augustulus. The imperial insignia were sent east to Constantinople. No new emperor was appointed in Italy. It is a useful date. It is also not the moment when Rome suddenly disappeared. The city of Rome was still there. Its people were still there. Roman law, Roman roads, Roman taxes, Roman titles, Roman Christianity, Roman language, Roman habits of government. All of these continued in some form. The eastern half of the empire, ruled from Constantinople, would survive for nearly another 1,000 years. What ended in 476 was a specific political arrangement, an independent Western imperial court capable of commanding much of Western Europe. And even that arrangement had been weakening for generations. Rome's unraveling was not a lightning strike. It was a long failure of a system that had become vast, expensive, militarized, and increasingly difficult to hold together. By the 3rd century, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Euphrates River. It controlled Mediterranean trade, commanded huge armies, and governed tens of millions of people through a network of cities, provinces, officials, laws, and taxes. This was one of the greatest administrative machines the ancient world had ever seen. But it was also under constant pressure. The first problem was succession. Rome never developed a consistently reliable way to decide who became emperor. Sometimes an emperor named his son. Sometimes he adopted a capable adult. Sometimes the Senate approved a candidate. Sometimes an army on a distant frontier simply declared its own commander emperor and marched toward Rome. During the crisis of the 3rd century, emperors rose and fell with frightening speed. Generals fought generals, provinces broke away. Armies demanded higher pay and political influence because armies, at the end of the day, held the weapons. A state can survive a bad ruler. It struggles to survive when every transfer of power risks civil war. And civil war was not just a palace drama happening far away from ordinary people. Armies had to be fed. Horses needed grain. Weapons had to be made. Taxes rose. Trade routes became dangerous. Farmers could lose crops to marching soldiers from either side. Cities could be forced to pay for defences, ransoms, and garrisons. Then there was the cost of the frontier. Rome's borders ran for thousands of miles. There was the Rhine, the Danube, the deserts of North Africa, the mountains and river valleys of the east. Maintaining those frontiers required forts, roads, supplies, commanders, intelligence networks, and troops stationed far from the wealthiest parts of the empire. For centuries, Rome had managed this balance through expansion. Conquest brought land, tribute, enslaved people, taxes, and prestige. But eventually the empire reached limits. It became harder to conquer new wealthy territories. Meanwhile, the cost of defending what Rome already possessed kept rising. This is one of the hidden traps of large systems. Growth can solve problems for a while. Then growth stops, but the bills remain. The empire tried to adapt. Emperors such as Diocletian and Constantine reorganized administration, strengthened the army, divided responsibilities between different rulers, and created more layers of government. These reforms helped Rome survive crises that might otherwise have destroyed it. But survival came with a price. More administration meant more taxation. More soldiers meant more demand on the economy. And as the empire became divided between east and west, the two halves did not carry equal burdens. The eastern provinces contained many of the richest cities, more concentrated wealth, and stronger commercial networks. The Western Empire had enormous territory, but less money to defend it. Then came pressures from beyond the frontier. In the late 4th century, groups later called Goths crossed into Roman territory seeking refuge from the Huns, a powerful confederation moving across the Eurasian steppe. Rome did not face a single united barbarian invasion, despite the simple maps we often see. It faced migrations, negotiations, alliances, betrayals, and military groups moving through a world already destabilized by pressures far beyond Rome's borders. Roman officials attempted to settle some Goths inside the empire. The arrangement went badly. Abuse, hunger, and mistrust turned refugees into enemies. In 378 CE, at the Battle of Adrianople, a Roman army was destroyed, and the Emperor Valens was killed. Rome recovered from this disaster, as it had recovered from many others. But the old confidence was gone. Over the next century, Western emperors increasingly depended on generals and allied non-Roman troops. Some of these allies served Rome loyally, others pursued their own interests. The line between Roman and barbarian was never as clean as later stories suggest. Many men labelled barbarians had served in Roman armies, adopted Roman titles, practiced Christianity, used Roman law, and wanted access to Roman wealth. They were not always trying to destroy Rome. Often they were trying to take a place within it. But the Western government could no longer reliably pay, command, or integrate all the forces it depended on. In 410, the Visigoths sacked the city of Rome. In 455, the Vandals did it again. These events shocked the Mediterranean world. Rome had been attacked before, but for centuries it had seemed almost eternal, the centre of an order too powerful to imagine falling apart. Yet even these sacks were not the end. The deeper collapse was administrative. Tax collection weakened. Provincial officials lost authority. Long-distance supply networks became less dependable. Armies became local. Roads still existed, but they were no longer maintained with the same imperial coordination. In parts of Western Europe, cities shrank dramatically. Public buildings decayed. Literacy became less widespread outside religious and administrative circles. Coinage and trade contracted in many regions. For ordinary people, the change may have felt less like the end of the world than the slow disappearance of services they had once taken for granted. A road not repaired, a market no longer supplied, a tax official replaced by a local strongman, a distant emperor whose name changes too often to matter. And yet fragments survived everywhere. In Italy, Gaul, Spain, and North Africa, New kingdoms ruled by Goths, Franks, Vandals and others adopted pieces of Roman government because Roman government still worked. They collected taxes, they issued laws, they used Latin. They relied on Roman landowners, bishops, clerks and administrators. The church became especially important. As imperial institutions weakened in the West, bishops often helped organize food, charity, negotiation, records and local authority. Monasteries copied texts. Church networks connected distant communities. Not all classical knowledge was saved and much was lost, but enough endured to shape the worlds that followed. And in the East, Rome did not fall at all. The empire centered on Constantinople continued to call itself Roman. Its citizens called themselves Romans. Its emperors preserved Roman law, taxation, diplomacy, military organization, and urban life on a scale the West could no longer sustain. What we now call the Byzantine Empire was, in its own understanding, the Roman Empire continuing. That fact changes the story. Rome was not erased. It was divided, transformed, diminished in some places, preserved in others, and rebuilt in new forms by people who inherited more from it than they may have realized. This is what a reset often looks like in history, not a clean break. Not ashes and silence everywhere, but a great network losing its center. A complex system becoming local, a world of imperial roads, standardized administration and Mediterranean connections breaking into smaller, tougher, more regional worlds. The empire unraveled. Its fragments became the foundation of the next age. But there is another layer beneath the political failures, the invasions, the tax crises, and the disappearing roads, forces no emperor could negotiate with. Disease, climate, a sky darkened by volcanic dust, a summer that never properly arrives, rain that falls in the wrong season, or does not fall at all. These are the invisible pressures that can turn an already strained society into a collapsing one. Disease is especially dangerous because it does not just kill people. It attacks every connection that keeps a complex civilization functioning. A pandemic reduces the number of farmers planting fields. Fewer farmers means less grain. Less grain means higher prices, hunger, unrest, and weaker tax revenue. It reduces the number of craftspeople making tools, soldiers guarding frontiers, sailors moving supplies, and officials collecting taxes. It can empty towns so quickly that the institutions designed to respond to crisis lose the very people needed to operate them. And then there is legitimacy. When rulers claim to maintain order between heaven and earth, between gods and people, between the state and its citizens, a disease that arrives without warning can make those claims feel hollow. Why are the prayers not working? Why are the rituals not working? Why are the granaries empty while bodies fill the streets? Those are not merely religious questions, they are political questions. They can weaken trust in governments, elites, and the entire system that once seemed permanent. The Roman world had faced epidemics before. The Antonine Plague in the 2nd century may have killed millions across the empire, though the exact scale remains uncertain. The plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century arrived during an era already marked by civil war, invasions, and economic instability. It is difficult to measure precisely what either outbreak did. Ancient sources are incomplete, sometimes dramatic, sometimes shaped by religious and political agendas. But the broad pattern is clear enough. Disease did not need to destroy Rome by itself. It only had to make every other problem harder to solve. Then, in 541 CE, long after the Western Empire had fragmented, a devastating outbreak reached the Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Justinian. It began, or at least became visible to the written record, in the port city of Pelusium in Egypt. From there it moved through Mediterranean trade routes toward Constantinople, the enormous imperial capital on the Bosporus. The historian Procopius described a city overwhelmed by death. Bodies piled up, normal work stopped, systems for burial could not keep pace. His numbers are almost certainly exaggerated, as ancient catastrophe accounts often are. But there is little doubt that this was a major outbreak of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The so-called Justinianic plague did not strike once and vanish. It returned in waves over roughly 2 centuries, affecting parts of Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. For Justinian's government, the timing could hardly have been worse. The emperor was attempting something extraordinary, reconquering former Western Roman territories, rebuilding imperial law, financing armies, restoring monuments, and presenting Constantinople as the centre of a renewed Roman world. For a moment, it almost worked. Imperial armies retook North Africa from the Vandals. They invaded Italy. Roman rule was extended, at least on paper, across territories that had been lost for generations. But reconquest required money, manpower, ships, food, and a population large enough to pay for all of it. Plague may have weakened that capacity. It may have reduced tax income, disrupted recruitment, and strained local communities already burdened by war. Historians still debate exactly how severe its long-term effects were in different regions. The evidence does not support a simple story in which one plague ended the ancient world overnight. But it does show something more interesting. Complex societies are not tested only by the size of a shock. They are tested by the number of other problems they are carrying when the shock arrives. And disease was not the only invisible force pressing on late antiquity. In the middle of the 6th century, a series of large volcanic eruptions appears to have injected enough material into the atmosphere to cool parts of the northern hemisphere. Tree rings point to unusually difficult growing seasons beginning around 536 CE. Written sources from several regions describe dim skies, strange weather, failed harvests, and cold. Researchers often call this period the Late Antique Little Ice Age. That name can be misleading if we imagine one uniform global freeze. Climate change does not land evenly. Some regions may receive less rain. Others may receive too much. Some crops fail under cooler summers. Other areas adapt or even benefit from changing conditions. The dates, causes, and consequences are still studied and debated. But the basic reality is hard to escape. A few degrees of cooling, a shortened growing season, or repeated harvest failures can matter enormously in a pre-industrial world. Modern societies can move food across oceans. Ancient societies could move grain too, sometimes across astonishing distances, but they had far less margin for failure. A bad harvest in one province might be manageable. Bad harvests in several connected regions, combined with war, taxation, disease, and disrupted trade, could become something else entirely. A cascade. That is the word to remember. One failed crop is a hardship. Several failed crops can produce famine. Famine weakens immune systems. Weakened populations are more vulnerable to disease. Disease reduces labour. Reduced labour means fewer crops the next year. And a government that responds by demanding more taxes from desperate communities may preserve its own revenue for a season while destroying the trust it needs to survive for centuries. This is why environmental stress does not determine outcomes on its own. Drought did not automatically destroy the Maya. Plague did not automatically destroy Rome. Volcanic winters did not automatically erase empires. Societies can adapt. They can store grain, diversify crops, maintain irrigation, open trade routes, reduce demands on struggling communities. Share information, move people from dangerous areas. Create institutions that respond quickly rather than protecting the privileges of a few. That is resilience. And before we go further, If you enjoy exploring these unanswered questions of the ancient world, you can get the channel's book about the 12 unexplained mysteries through the website. The link is in the description, because the real mystery is not why disasters happen. Disasters are guaranteed. The mystery is why some societies bend, reorganize, and survive, while others become brittle enough that one more bad year turns a crisis into a reset. Nature provides the shock, but human systems decide how far the damage travels. And when damage travels far enough, it does not only destroy buildings, populations, and governments. It destroys memory. This is one of the hardest things to understand about the ancient past. We tend to imagine that if a civilization had achieved something important, something advanced, something comparable to our own capabilities, it would have left obvious evidence behind. A machine, a book, a factory, a detailed map, a city still standing exactly where it stood. But that is not how evidence works. Most of human life is made from things that disappear. Wood rots, cloth decays, leather hardens, cracks and vanishes. Rope, baskets, sails, paper, parchment, wax tablets, medicines, food stores, wooden houses, boats, bridges, furniture, and the tools people used every day are all vulnerable to water, fire, insects, fungi, weather and time. Give a wooden village a few centuries in a wet climate, and there may be almost nothing left except post holes in the soil. Give a library a fire, a flood, or a few decades of neglect, and thousands of years of accumulated knowledge can become ash, mould, or unreadable fragments. Give a society a collapse, and the people most capable of preserving specialized knowledge may be the first to disappear. This creates what we might call a knowledge bottleneck. Not a genetic bottleneck, like the one our distant ancestors survived, but a cultural one, a narrowing, a moment when a society that once contained engineers, navigators, scribes, architects, metalworkers, astronomers, doctors, and administrators is reduced to scattered survivors carrying only what they can remember, teach, and use. Imagine a city with 1,000 different skills embedded inside it. One person knows how to make glass clear enough for precise lenses. Another knows the formula for a waterproof mortar. Another understands how to organize a grain fleet across an entire sea. Another can read tax records written in a script few people outside the bureaucracy understand. Another knows which metals to mix to produce a blade that will not shatter in winter. None of that knowledge exists in isolation. It depends on workshops, apprentices, supply chains, written manuals, reliable food, customers wealthy enough to pay for specialized labor, and institutions stable enough to train the next generation. Remove those systems and knowledge can vanish much faster than intelligence. The survivors are not less human. They are not suddenly incapable of thought. They are simply operating with fewer tools, fewer materials, fewer teachers, and less time. A person who knows how to repair a water wheel cannot rebuild an industrial economy alone. A shipbuilder without timber, iron nails, trained crews, or safe harbours cannot preserve an entire maritime tradition. A scholar who can still read a complex text cannot save it if the library burns and there is no one left to copy it. This is why ruins can mislead us. Stone survives, massive temples survive. Tombs survive. Walls, monuments, foundations, and carved inscriptions survive. And because they survive, they can make the past look obsessed with stone. But ancient people were not spending all their lives inside stone buildings any more than we spend all our lives inside concrete monuments. Much of their real world was wood, fibre, clay, earth reeds, and living landscapes. The Roman Empire is remembered for aqueducts, roads, amphitheatres, and marble statues. Yet its daily functioning depended on things that usually leave far less trace: carts, warehouses, account books, river barges, temporary bridges, cloth sails, wooden cranes, merchant contracts, local market knowledge, and millions of ordinary decisions made by people whose names were never carved in stone. The Maya left extraordinary temples and inscriptions, but their civilization also depended on perishable books, painted cloth, agricultural tools, wooden buildings, and knowledge stored in living communities. Most Maya codices were destroyed after the Spanish conquest. Only a handful survive today, a handful, from a civilization that produced text for centuries. Think about what that means. If future archaeologists found only a few surviving books from our entire world, what would they conclude about us? What would they understand about medicine, electricity, computer programming, aviation, music, law, or the millions of specialized skills hidden inside ordinary objects? Probably not much. And lost knowledge is not only a prehistoric problem. History gives us documented examples. Libraries burned in war. Archives were deliberately destroyed by conquerors. Workshops were abandoned when trade routes failed. Scripts became unreadable when the states and priesthoods that maintained them disappeared. For nearly 2,000 years, Egyptian hieroglyphs could be seen but not read. The writing system had survived on temple walls, yet the cultural key needed to unlock it was gone. Linear B vanished after the Bronze Age collapse and was not deciphered again until the 20th century. The knowledge had not been erased from stone tablets completely. But for centuries, it may as well have been. Even technological methods can survive only as fragments. A craft may continue in one isolated valley, one family workshop, one monastery, one shipyard, one guild, or one community far from the centers of power. The broader civilization loses the system that once supported it, but a small piece remains. A blacksmith remembers an alloy. A mason preserves a building technique. A healer remembers a plant remedy. A sailor remembers a route by stars and currents. These fragments can be astonishing. They can make it seem as if a lost high technology is hiding beneath the surface of history. Sometimes they are evidence of genuine continuity, skills passed carefully across generations. Sometimes they are later reinventions. Sometimes we simply do not know. That uncertainty matters, because there is a danger here. The archaeological record is incomplete, deeply incomplete. It is biased towards stone, fired clay, dry caves, tombs, shipwrecks, and places protected from decay. Absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. But it is not proof of a hidden global civilization either. A missing archive does not automatically mean ancient computers. A sophisticated artifact does not automatically mean a forgotten industrial age. A mystery is not a conclusion. The responsible position is more interesting than either extreme. We should not assume that ancient people were simple because their tools look simple to us. They had skills, memories, and systems we may only partially understand, but we also have to follow the evidence where it leads. A planet-wide technological civilization would likely leave multiple kinds of traces: large-scale mining, industrial waste, unusual chemical signatures, widespread manufactured materials, transformed landscapes, and consistent archaeological layers across continents. So far, no accepted evidence demonstrates that such a civilization existed before known history. Yet the smaller lesson is undeniable. Civilizations do not have to vanish completely for their knowledge to vanish. They only need to lose the institutions that keep knowledge alive, and that is what makes every collapse more frightening than a pile of ruins. A ruined city can be rebuilt, a lost language can sometimes be deciphered, but a skill forgotten by the last person who understood it may be gone forever. Which brings us to the objects that seem to resist that conclusion. Strange maps, unusual mechanisms, artifacts so impressive that they invite a dangerous question. What if the past was not merely more complex than we remember? What if some pieces of it do not fit the story at all? And this is where the mystery becomes irresistible. Because scattered across museums, excavation reports, old collections, and internet videos are objects that seem to whisper the same thing. Someone knew more than they were supposed to know. A map that appears too accurate, a stone wall fitted too precisely, a metal mechanism found in an ancient shipwreck, a clay jar that some people call a battery, an astronomical calculation so sophisticated that it feels almost modern. These objects are compelling because they touch a very deep fear and a very deep hope. The fear is that history is fragile enough to lose almost anything. The hope is that perhaps our ancestors were not struggling in darkness as long as we imagine. Perhaps there were earlier peaks of knowledge, earlier civilizations, earlier worlds, whose achievements survived only as strange fragments. And sometimes that instinct begins with something real. Ancient people were often far more capable than modern stereotypes allow. They navigated oceans without GPS. They built monuments without cranes or engines. They tracked the movements of planets with patient observation over generations. They moved stone blocks weighing dozens, sometimes hundreds of tons. They created calendars accurate enough to organize agriculture, ritual, taxation, and political power across vast territories. The real past is already extraordinary, but extraordinary does not automatically mean impossible. Take the Piri-Reis map, one of the most famous examples. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral, it shows parts of Europe, Africa, and South America. Some writers have claimed it also depicts Antarctica, perhaps copied from maps made by a lost civilization before the continent was covered in ice. It is a thrilling idea. There is only one problem. The apparent Antarctica is more likely a distorted extension of South America, drawn from incomplete and uneven source maps. Piri-Reis himself wrote that he had compiled his work from earlier maps, including Portuguese charts and a map associated with Columbus. That is impressive enough. It tells us that early modern navigators were combining information from multiple traditions into increasingly ambitious world maps. But it does not require an Ice Age cartographic civilization. Then there is the Antikythera mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera. This corroded mass of bronze turned out to contain a complex system of gears. Built around the 2nd or 1st century BCE, it could model astronomical cycles, track eclipses, and display the movements of the sun and moon. For a long time it seemed impossible. A machine this intricate, made more than 2,000 years ago. Surely it had to be an artifact from some unknown technological age. But the more researchers studied it, the more remarkable and understandable it became. Greek mathematicians and astronomers had centuries of accumulated knowledge behind them. They understood geometry. They made sophisticated observations. They worked with bronze. They built water clocks, measuring instruments and mechanical devices. The mechanism was rare, perhaps the product of an elite workshop tradition that mostly vanished. It was not evidence that the ancient Greeks had factories, electricity, or computers. It was evidence that a civilization can achieve astonishing precision in one specialized field, then lose much of that expertise when its networks break apart. In other words, the Antikythera mechanism does not destroy the historical story. It confirms the knowledge bottleneck. The same is true of ancient stonework. At places like Giza, Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, Baalbek, and Puma Punku, huge blocks appear fitted together with almost unbelievable care. Some joints are so tight that a knife blade barely fits between them. Others are cut into complex angles that make modern visitors wonder how anyone could have shaped them without power tools. And the answer is not always complete. Archaeologists do not know every step used by every ancient builder. Quarrying, hauling, shaping and placing massive stone required labour systems and practical techniques that are still debated in detail. That is a genuine unanswered question, but we do not know every step is very different from therefore they used lost machines. Experimental archaeology has shown that stone can be cut, drilled, polished, moved and fitted with stone hammers, copper tools, abrasive sand, wooden sledges, ropes, levers, ramps, and enormous amounts of trained labour. Slow methods can produce precise results. Repetition can produce mastery. A workforce organised for generations can accomplish things that look impossible to a person imagining one builder with a hand tool. The Baghdad battery is another classic case. These are clay vessels found near Baghdad, containing copper cylinders and iron rods. Fill one with an acidic liquid, and it can produce a small electrical charge. That much is true, but what were they actually for? Some have suggested electroplating, others think they may have been containers for scrolls, sacred objects, or ritual materials. No wires, electrical devices, or clearly plated objects have been found in a context that proves ancient battery technology. The experiment works, the interpretation remains uncertain, and that distinction is everything. An object is not just an object. Its meaning depends on context. Where exactly was it found? Was the excavation properly recorded? What layer of soil contained it? Can the material be dated? Is it associated with homes, workshops, graves, temples, ships, or later disturbances? Does it have parallels elsewhere? Can the proposed use be replicated with the tools and materials available at the time? Provenance, dating, context, replication. These sound less exciting than lost empires, but they are how archaeology separates a real mystery from a story we want to believe. Ancient astronomy offers perhaps the best lesson. The Maya, Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, Chinese, Polynesian navigators, and many other cultures developed sophisticated ways of reading the sky. They predicted eclipses, tracked planetary cycles, built calendars, aligned structures, and navigated across open water using stars. None of this makes them primitive. None of it requires extraterrestrials, secret global empires, or vanished super technology. It requires observation, memory, mathematics, institutions capable of preserving knowledge across generations, which, when you think about it, may be even more impressive. The temptation of mystery begins when we mistake uncertainty for evidence. A gap in our knowledge becomes a blank canvas, and into that blank space we project Atlantis, ancient machines, forgotten continents, and previous civilizations that were supposedly more advanced than our own. Maybe some questions will remain open for decades. Maybe new discoveries will force historians to rewrite parts of the story. That has happened before, and it will happen again. But wonder does not need exaggeration. The past is not boring because it lacks impossible artifacts. The past is astonishing because ordinary humans, working with limited materials and fragile institutions, repeatedly found ways to do things that still challenge our imagination. And that leaves us with a more difficult question. If civilizations can create knowledge this subtle, this precise, this easy to lose, then how many times has humanity built something extraordinary, only to watch the system holding it together begin to fail? That question is where the idea of the 7 civilizations begins. Not 7 civilizations in the ordinary historical sense. Not Egypt, Rome, the Maya, China, Mesopotamia, and us, lined up neatly like chapters in a textbook. Something bigger, something more dramatic. The claim in its strongest form is that humanity has risen to civilization again and again. That whole worlds have reached a peak, collapsed in fire, flood, climate disaster or war, and then been forgotten so completely that the survivors had to begin from almost nothing. And we are not the first civilization, we are the 7th. It sounds ancient, like a secret passed down through temples, myths, and ruined cities. But the exact number is not an established archaeological conclusion. There is no excavation, inscription, genetic study, or scholarly timeline that proves 6 global civilizations existed before ours. The number comes from something older and more complicated. It comes from the human habit of seeing time not as a straight road, but as a wheel. Modern people often imagine history as progress. Stone tools become bronze. Bronze becomes iron. Villages become cities. Cities become nations. Nations build railroads, computers, satellites, and eventually, perhaps, something beyond us. Forward, upward, one direction. But many ancient cultures looked at time and saw a different pattern. They saw repetition, a golden age followed by decline, order followed by disorder, creation followed by destruction. Then, after the destruction, a new beginning. In Hindu traditions, time moves through vast cycles called yugas. There are 4 ages: Satya Yuga, an age of truth and harmony; Treta Yuga, Dvapara Yuga, and Kali Yuga, the final age, marked by conflict, moral decline, and spiritual confusion. When the cycle ends, the world is renewed and another begins. These cycles are enormous. Not centuries, not even millennia. In some traditional calculations, they stretch across millions of years. The point was not that ancient Indians had a modern archaeological sequence hidden in scripture. The point was that human order was never considered permanent. Even the greatest age could decay. Even decay could be followed by renewal. The ancient Greeks had their own version. The poet Hesiod described a succession of ages: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. The Golden Age was a time of ease, abundance, and closeness to the gods. By the Iron Age, people lived with labour, conflict, injustice, and decline. To Hesiod, the past was not primitive. In some ways it was better. That idea appears again and again across the ancient world. Not always with the same number, not always with the same cause of destruction, but with the same unsettling rhythm. Things begin well. They grow powerful. They become corrupt, proud, divided, or careless. Then something breaks. In Mesoamerican traditions, the world was also understood as having passed through previous creations. Among the Aztec, the myth of the 5 suns described earlier worlds destroyed by catastrophes: jaguars, wind, fire, and flood. The present world was not the first. It was the latest fragile age, living under the shadow of the destruction that had ended those before it. The Maya recorded time through immense repeating calendar cycles. Their monuments tracked eras so large that modern dates can feel tiny beside them. This did not mean they predicted a specific modern apocalypse, despite what many people claimed around 2012. But it does show that they thought on a scale of recurrence, renewal, endings, and beginnings. In Norse tradition, there was Ragnarok. The world would be shaken by winter, war, monsters, and fire. Gods would die. The old order would fall. But even there, the story did not end with emptiness. After destruction, the world rises again, green, cleansed, ready for survivors. And then there are flood stories. Mesopotamia had them. The Hebrew Bible had them. Greek mythology had Deucalion. Indian tradition had Manu. Stories from many regions describe a world ruined by water, with a small group surviving to carry life into the next age. These stories are not all evidence of one literal global flood. They emerged in different places over long periods, shaped by local landscapes, religious beliefs, and cultural exchange. Some may preserve memories of real regional disasters. Rivers flood, seas rise, coastal settlements vanish. Entire communities can be erased in a single season. But myths do something archaeology cannot always do. They preserve emotional truth. They remember that the world can change faster than people expect. They remember that survival may depend on a few families, a boat, a mountain refuge, a cache of seeds, a fragment of knowledge carried through the dark. So how do we get from ancient cycles to the idea that we are civilization number 7? Usually through modern retelling. Writers, alternative historians, spiritual thinkers, and internet researchers begin with myths about earlier ages. Then they place them beside real evidence of collapse, drowned ice age coastlines, abandoned cities, lost technologies, sudden climate shifts, erased trade routes. Then they add the gaps in the archaeological record, especially the vast periods before writing. And the gaps are real. Writing is only about 5,000 years old. Cities are older than that, but not by much on the scale of human existence. Homo sapiens has existed for roughly 300,000 years. For most of that time, people left behind tools, bones, hearths, pigments, and scattered traces, not libraries or stone archives. That silence invites imagination. Maybe there were 6 great worlds before ours. Maybe their ruins lie beneath the sea, under deserts, forests, modern cities, or layers of sediment no one has excavated yet. Maybe myths are distorted memories of them. It is possible to ask those questions. It is not responsible to pretend we already know the answer. Archaeologists have found repeated regional civilizations, repeated collapses, and repeated recoveries. They have found societies that rose to extraordinary complexity and then fragmented so thoroughly that later people lived among their ruins without understanding who built them. What they have not found is evidence for 6 earlier global technological civilizations comparable to the modern industrial world. No worldwide layer of factories, no planet-spanning network of industrial waste. No unmistakable trace of earlier satellites, power grids, mass-produced metals, or fossil fuel economies buried deep in prehistoric strata. That does not make the 7 civilization idea meaningless. It tells us what it really is, not a proven count, a metaphor, a warning, a story built from a pattern that is undeniably real. Civilizations do not last forever. And perhaps the idea resonates now because for the first time in a very long time, we can feel how vulnerable complexity really is. We live inside systems so vast that almost nobody understands the whole machine. Food travels across continents. Electricity arrives through networks of mines, cables, power stations, laws, workers, software, shipping routes, and fuel supplies. A drought in one region, a war in another, a virus, a financial panic, a broken canal, a failed harvest, can send consequences racing around the planet. We look at ancient ruins and wonder how their world disappeared. Then we look at our own world and wonder whether someone, thousands of years from now, might be asking the same question. And this is where the pattern becomes clearer. Not a secret weapon, not a lost force hidden beneath history, not proof that some mysterious hand reaches down every few thousand years and wipes the board clean. Something more ordinary, and because it is ordinary, something more dangerous. The pattern is cascading failure. A civilization becomes so connected that one problem does not stay one problem. It spreads. A drought is no longer just a drought. It becomes a food crisis. The food crisis becomes a price crisis. The price crisis becomes debt, migration, unrest, political blame, and violence. Trade becomes dangerous. Taxes stop arriving. Armies stop getting paid. The government loses authority. People begin protecting themselves, their families, their villages, their local networks. And once trust begins to disappear, every other problem gets harder to solve. Think about what a large civilization actually depends on. Food has to move from fields to cities. Water has to arrive through canals, aqueducts, wells, pipes, or reservoirs. Traders need roads, ships, credit, guards, ports, warehouses, and predictable laws. Governments need taxes. Armies need food, equipment, and loyalty. Cities need people to believe that grain will arrive next month, that money will still buy something, that courts will enforce agreements, that officials are capable of responding when danger comes. None of these systems stands alone. Food supports workers. Workers maintain infrastructure. Infrastructure supports trade. Trade brings in materials, wealth, and sometimes the grain that feeds cities. Taxes fund the state. The state protects trade routes, organizes defenses, repairs roads, manages water, and punishes those who try to take advantage of chaos. And all of it rests on something invisible. Trust. Trust that the ship will come. Trust that the ruler can act. Trust that the merchant will honor the deal. Trust that your neighbors will not turn against you when supplies grow scarce. When the system works, this interconnection creates extraordinary power. A city can feed tens of thousands of people who do not farm. A kingdom can move bronze, timber, grain, horses, and ideas across enormous distances. An empire can maintain roads, law, coinage, and military protection across continents. Complexity makes abundance possible, but it also creates dependency. And dependency is where resilience can quietly turn into brittleness. A simple village may have very little, but if it grows its own food, knows its own water sources, and relies mostly on nearby people, a disruption in a distant land may barely touch it. A palace economy is different. Take the late Bronze Age world, around 1200 BC. Egypt, the Hittite Empire, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, the Levant, and Mesopotamia were not isolated kingdoms sitting in separate boxes. They were part of an international system. Kings exchanged letters, gifts, marriage partners, luxury goods, raw materials, and military support. Bronze itself required connection. Copper might come from Cyprus, tin from far away, timber from one region, grain from another, crafted goods from another. For centuries, this network made the eastern Mediterranean rich. Then the shocks began. Climate stress may have reduced harvests in some areas. Warfare intensified. Populations moved. Trade routes became dangerous. Palaces faced rebellions, invasions, and shortages. The exact balance of causes is still debated. There was no single accepted explanation for every collapse in every region. But the outcome is hard to miss. Once major nodes in the network began failing, they made neighbouring failures more likely. A kingdom that could no longer import grain struggled to feed its population. A palace that could not collect taxes struggled to pay soldiers. A port attacked by raiders disrupted supplies for cities far inland. A state weakened by famine became easier to invade. An invaded state could no longer protect the routes everyone else depended on. The system did not fall like a single building hit by one hammer. It unravelled like a net, with more and more strands snapping. That same logic appears in different forms. In the Maya world, in Rome, in medieval states hit by plague and harvest failure, and in modern economies. The details are never identical. History does not repeat with a perfect script, but complexity often produces the same vulnerability. The more specialized a society becomes, the more each part assumes the other parts will keep working. And when they do not, failure can move faster than anyone expects. Our own world is connected on a scale no Bronze Age king could imagine. A smartphone depends on minerals mined in multiple countries, factories on another continent, shipping lanes, power grids, software systems, finance, and workers who may never know one another's names. Food in a supermarket may have crossed oceans, medicine may rely on ingredients produced in only a handful of facilities. A disruption in one canal, one port, one region at war, one major crop zone, can send prices rising across the planet. That does not mean collapse is inevitable. Modern systems also have strengths ancient civilizations did not. Scientific knowledge, rapid communication, emergency logistics, international aid, diverse energy sources, and the ability to see some dangers coming. But the old warning remains. A system can be powerful and fragile at the same time. The recurring pattern behind so many collapses is not a proven hidden force. It is systemic brittleness. Societies build connections to become stronger. Then, if those connections become too concentrated, too unequal, too dependent on constant stability, they lose the ability to fail in small pieces. Instead, one failure becomes 5. 5 become 50. And before long, people living inside the system no longer experience it as a crisis. They experience it as the end of the world they knew. But the end of the world they knew was not the end of people. This is the part collapse stories often miss. When palaces burn, when roads become unsafe, when money loses value, when cities empty and governments disappear, survivors do not simply wake up in a blank new age. They carry things with them, not everything. That is the tragedy. But enough, a farmer still knows when to plant, even if the old irrigation system has failed. A healer still remembers which bark reduces fever, which roots are dangerous, which wounds need to be cleaned. A smith may no longer have access to imported tin, but he remembers how metal behaves in a fire. A sailor remembers coastlines. A mason remembers how stone walls were fitted. A midwife remembers what her mother taught her. An elder remembers the names of rivers, seasons, ancestors, enemies, safe paths, and places where water can still be found in drought. Civilization does not survive only in libraries. It survives in hands. It survives in habits. It survives in stories repeated so many times that nobody remembers who first told them. And after a collapse, those stories can become more important than ever. Imagine being a child in a village built beside the ruins of a city your grandparents once knew. You see broken walls larger than anything your village could build. You find carved stones, old roads leading nowhere, fragments of pottery, coins with the faces of rulers whose names no longer mean anything. How do you explain that world at first? Perhaps people remember it clearly. They remember the tax collectors, the markets, the armies, the great temples. They remember that the old city was real because they lived there. But generations pass. Details fade. Memories compress. History becomes legend. The old rulers become giants, gods, demons or wise ancestors. A ruined fortress becomes the palace of a lost king. An abandoned canal becomes a work of beings with impossible strength. A disaster becomes a flood sent to punish human pride, a fire from heaven, a war at the end of an age. This does not mean ancient stories are worthless as history. Quite the opposite. They can preserve real memories of migrations, eruptions, floods, famines, and vanished places. But memory is not a recording device. It protects meaning more faithfully than detail. It remembers that something terrible happened. It remembers that people were warned. It remembers that the old world was lost, and it tells the next generation how to avoid losing theirs. Sometimes the lesson is practical. Do not build too close to the river. Store grain. Keep alliances with neighbouring villages. Do not depend on one harvest. Do not anger the people who control the water. Sometimes the lesson is moral. Pride brought down the city. Greed offended the gods. Kings became corrupt. People forgot the old laws. We cannot always separate practical memory from spiritual interpretation. In many ancient societies there was no clean line between them. A ritual for rain could also be a way of organizing labor. A sacred calendar could preserve knowledge about seasons. A pilgrimage route could maintain contact between communities that might otherwise become isolated. This is why survivors rarely rebuild the exact system that failed. After a major collapse, people have learned painfully that the old system was not permanent. They may not trust distant rulers anymore. They may not want to send their grain, children, or labor to a palace that cannot protect them. They may retreat towards smaller communities where leaders are known personally, where food is grown nearby, where decisions can be made face to face. This pattern appears again and again. After the Bronze Age palace systems collapsed, many regions of the eastern Mediterranean became more local. International trade did not vanish forever, but the giant centralized administrations that had managed it were gone. Communities adapted to a world with fewer imports, fewer specialists, and less certainty. After the Western Roman Empire fragmented, local power became more important across much of Europe. Cities shrank in some regions. Long-distance trade changed. Roman institutions survived unevenly through churches, local elites, Eastern imperial territories, and legal traditions, but the unified world of Roman administration was not simply restarted. The same thing happened in many other places. Collapse tends to break large systems into smaller ones first. This is not necessarily a step backward in every way. Small communities can be more resilient. They can respond quickly. They can rely on local knowledge. They can survive when roads fail and distant authorities stop answering. But decentralization also has costs. Fewer people can support full-time specialists. Large engineering projects become harder. Writing may become less widespread if schools, scribes, and administrations disappear. Trade goods grow scarce. Knowledge that depended on institutions can narrow to whatever one household, monastery, guild, temple, or village manages to preserve. That is the knowledge bottleneck in human form, not ignorance replacing intelligence overnight, but a vast library being forced into a few surviving minds. And those minds do not stay in one place. They move. Collapse creates migrants, refugees, exiles, traders, escaped slaves, defeated soldiers, wandering craftsmen, displaced farmers, and families carrying whatever they can load onto animals, boats, or their own backs. They do not bring an entire civilization with them. No refugee caravan carries a functioning bureaucracy, an irrigation empire, a university, and a supply chain. But they bring pieces, seeds, tools, craft techniques, religious practices, songs, languages, marriage customs, memories of distant markets and safer routes. A group fleeing a collapsing city may introduce new crops to a frontier region. A displaced metalworker may teach a village how to make better tools. A merchant community may preserve weights, measures, contracts, and literacy long after the state that once protected trade has vanished. A priesthood may keep calendars and genealogies alive. A military population may carry fortification techniques into a new homeland. Then, over generations, these fragments mix with local traditions, and something new emerges, not the old civilization restored. Something stranger, a successor society. This is one reason history can look deceptively discontinuous. A new kingdom may seem to appear from nowhere, speaking a different language, worshipping different gods, building in a different style. But beneath the surface it may contain inherited skills, repurposed institutions, and memories from the world before. Even the ruins themselves become part of the rebuilding. Some are treated as sacred places. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried long before modern archaeology uncovered it, though the reasons remain uncertain. Roman ruins became churches, fortresses, homes, and sources of stone. Maya cities were revisited, remembered, and incorporated into later sacred landscapes. Across the world, abandoned monuments have been quarried for building material because worked stone is valuable, available, and already shaped. To later people, a ruined city can be many things at once. A mine, a shrine, a warning, a claim to legitimacy, a reminder that powerful people once lived here and still disappeared. And that changes how rebuilding happens. The survivors do not begin from zero. But neither do they begin with a clean blueprint for restoring what was lost. They build from what remains, what they remember, what their new environment allows, and what they now fear repeating. Every reset, if we can call it that, creates a different future, because the survivors are different. They have different losses, different landscapes, different neighbours, different memories of what failed. The world after Rome could not become Rome again. The world after the Bronze Age could not simply rebuild the old palace network. The world after a drought, plague, invasion, or flood carries the scar of that event into its institutions, beliefs, and choices. And that is the deeper pattern. Collapse destroys structures. Survival transforms people. The next civilization is not built despite the ruins of the last one. In many ways it is built from them. But this raises a larger, more unsettling question. If ruins can be buried, reused, drowned, turned into legends, and broken down for building stone, then how much could be missing? Could there have been a civilization before ours, perhaps far older than Egypt, Rome, or the first cities of Mesopotamia, that rose to a global scale and then vanished so completely that we no longer recognize its traces? It is a powerful idea, and it deserves a careful answer. First, we need to be clear about what global civilization means. A scattered network of sophisticated cities is one thing. A civilization like ours, powered by fossil fuels, global trade, mass industry, chemical manufacturing, mining, aviation, concrete, steel, and plastics, is something else entirely. A truly industrial civilization changes the planet. Not just one valley, not one river system, the planet. It digs enormous quantities of material out of the ground. Coal, oil, copper, iron, lithium, rare earth metals. It moves mountains, it redirects rivers, it clears forests. It covers landscapes in roads, ports, dams, factories, farms, and cities. It releases carbon that had been stored underground for hundreds of millions of years. It leaves behind chemical compounds that do not occur naturally in the same forms or concentrations, and some of those changes would not disappear easily. Future geologists looking at the rocks beneath their feet might find a sudden spike in carbon dioxide recorded in sediments. They might find unusual ratios of carbon isotopes, evidence that vast quantities of ancient fossil carbon had been burned in a very short period. They might find traces of heavy metals from mining and smelting. Mercury, lead, chromium, industrial pollutants carried by wind and water into lake beds, ocean mud and ice. They might find a strange layer containing plastic. Not necessarily intact water bottles and shopping bags. Time is ruthless. Heat, pressure, microbes and chemistry would break most things apart. Cities would erode, steel would rust, concrete would crack. Coastlines would shift. Entire urban regions could be buried under sediment or ground into dust by glaciers. But plastic leaves chemical fingerprints. So do synthetic compounds. So do radioactive isotopes produced by nuclear testing and reactors. So does the enormous reshaping of landscapes caused by industrial agriculture, mining, and construction. A global civilization may vanish from the surface, but it would have a hard time vanishing from geology. This is the core of an idea sometimes called the Silurian hypothesis. The name comes from science fiction, but the question is serious in a very specific way. It does not claim that ancient reptiles built skyscrapers, or that a forgotten human civilization ruled Earth millions of years ago. It asks a scientific thought experiment. If an industrial civilization had existed deep in Earth's past, what evidence would it leave behind? And would we recognize that evidence if we found it? The answer is possibly, but not perfectly. The deeper we go into time, the more the record is damaged. Ocean floors are constantly recycled into Earth's interior. Mountains rise and erode away. Sediments are compressed, heated, folded, and transformed. Most living things never fossilize. Most landscapes leave no direct trace at all. So the absence of an ancient city is not surprising. After tens of millions of years, we would not expect to find roads, houses, machines, or libraries waiting neatly underground. But the absence of a planetary signature is more meaningful. We have found dramatic shifts in Earth's ancient climate. We have found mass extinctions, volcanic events, asteroid impacts, and sudden changes in carbon chemistry. These events can look strange. They can even resemble, in broad outline, some effects of industrial activity. But so far none provides convincing evidence of a previous industrial civilization. No unmistakable layer of synthetic materials. No global pattern of refined metals that cannot be explained by natural processes. No clear industrial waste signal. No fossilized infrastructure. No evidence that ancient animals or earlier humans created a worldwide technological system comparable to ours. That does not mean the past is fully known. Far from it. There are vast regions we have barely explored. Much of the ancient coastline from the end of the Ice Age now lies underwater, beneath seas that rose more than 100 meters. Coastal settlements were often the best places to live, near fish, rivers, fertile land, and trade routes. Many of humanity's early experiments with permanent settlement may now be drowned, buried, or destroyed by waves. Dense forests hide ruins. Deserts preserve some sites while erasing others. Tropical rain, roots, insects, and acidic soils can destroy wood, cloth, bone, and even stone faster than we like to imagine. Archaeology keeps finding sophisticated regional cultures where earlier generations assumed there had been only scattered villages. That possibility is real. There may be lost cities beneath shallow seas. Unknown trade networks in deserts, complex societies hidden under forests. Cultures that developed impressive astronomy, engineering, navigation, agriculture, or art, and then collapsed before leaving written records. But that is different from claiming a lost global super-civilization. The first possibility fits what we know about the fragility of evidence. The second requires evidence equal to the claim, and that distinction matters. Mystery is not proof, a gap in the record is not a lost empire. An ancient monument we do not fully understand is not evidence of impossible technology. History is full of surprises, but surprises still leave clues. So perhaps the most honest answer is this. Could sophisticated cultures be missing from the record? Almost certainly could entire regional civilizations remain undiscovered. Very possibly. Could a previous industrial civilization have risen, transformed the whole planet, and disappeared without leaving a clear geological signature? That is much harder to believe, not impossible in the abstract, but unsupported by the evidence we have, and maybe that is the lesson hidden inside the question. We do not need to invent a vanished global civilization to understand how much can be lost. We only need to look at the civilizations we know existed. Their ruins are already telling us how quickly certainty can become silence, and that brings us back to the uncomfortable part. Not the lost civilization beneath the sea, not the hypothetical industrial species buried in deep time. Os, What would future people, if there are future people, see when they look back at the early 21st century? Would they see a civilization at its peak, a species that connected nearly every inhabited region of the planet through trade, communication, energy, and shared knowledge? Or would they see another familiar pattern, a society so complex, so tightly connected, that its strengths slowly became its greatest vulnerabilities? In some ways we are not so different from Rome, the Maya, the Bronze Age kingdoms, or the cities of Mesopotamia. They all depended on systems larger than any one person could understand. Farmers depended on rains. Cities depended on grain shipments. Kings depended on tax collectors, soldiers, scribes, roads, ports, and the cooperation of people who would never meet them. When those systems worked, they created abundance that earlier generations could barely imagine. When they failed, the failure travelled. A drought in one region became hunger in another. A disrupted trade route meant no bronze, no timber, no grain, no tools. Political instability weakened defences. Weakened defences invited raids. Raids disrupted farming. Less farming meant less tax revenue. Less revenue meant weaker governments. What looked at first like a temporary crisis could become a chain reaction. Our system works the same way, only now the chain reaches around the planet. A microchip made in one region may be needed for a car built in another, sold in a third, and dependent on minerals mined thousands of miles away. Food grown in one hemisphere is eaten in another. Oil, gas, electricity, fertilizer, shipping containers, satellites, banking networks, hospitals, refrigeration, and computer servers are all tied together in ways so complicated that almost nobody sees the whole machine. And most of the time, that machine is astonishing. It feeds billions. It moves medicine across oceans. It lets a scientist in one country share an idea with a researcher on the other side of Earth in seconds. It gives us warning systems for storms, vaccines developed at extraordinary speed, global records of climate, disease, and population. But complexity has a price. The more connected a system becomes, the less easily it can fail in one place and stay failed in one place. A drought is no longer just a local drought when global food prices rise. A war is no longer just a regional war when shipping lanes close, energy costs spike, and fertilizer becomes scarce. A disease outbreak is no longer separated by mountains and months of travel. In a world of airports and megacities, it can circle the globe before anyone fully understands what it is. Climate change adds another layer of pressure. Not because every flood, fire, heat wave, or storm can be blamed on a single cause. Weather has always been dangerous, but the long-term warming trend is increasing risks that ancient societies would recognize immediately. Unreliable rainfall, failing harvests, rising seas, extreme heat, stressed water supplies, and movement of people away from places that can no longer support them. The difference is scale. The Maya could not import grain from another continent. Rome could not coordinate relief through satellites. Bronze Age rulers could not watch crop conditions from space. We can, but we also depend on energy at a level no earlier civilization could have imagined. Modern cities do not merely use energy, they breathe it. Electricity keeps water moving, food cold, hospitals functioning, payments processing, homes heated or cooled, and information flowing. Remove reliable power for long enough, and the systems built on top of it begin to fail one by one. Then there is the digital world. Our knowledge is more abundant than any civilization in history. Libraries have become databases. Maps, scientific papers, engineering plans, medical records, languages, photographs, legal codes, and billions of personal memories exist in forms that can be copied almost instantly. That sounds like the ultimate defense against a knowledge bottleneck. And in many ways it is. A single printed book can survive on a shelf for centuries. But a digital archive needs electricity, hardware, software, networks, passwords, formats, and people who know how to maintain all of them. We have stored more information than the Library of Alexandria could have held in 1,000 lifetimes. Yet much of it is locked inside machines that may become unreadable surprisingly fast. And information is not the same thing as understanding. A person can download the plans for a power plant and still have no ability to build one. A society can preserve every textbook in existence and still lose the factories, mines, supply chains, skilled workers, and stable institutions needed to turn knowledge into reality. That is one reason recovery after a modern collapse could be easier in some ways, and harder in others. Easier because we know more. We understand germs, electricity, metallurgy, agriculture, weather, engineering, and the shape of the planet. We have books, backups, seeds, tools, and scientific methods. Even a small surviving population might inherit a map of discoveries that took earlier civilizations thousands of years to make. Harder because our daily lives are specialized. Few of us know how to grow food without industrial fertilizer, repair complex machinery without replacement parts, purify water without modern infrastructure, or make the basic materials that sustain modern life. The ladder of complexity is incredibly high, and if enough rungs disappear at once, climbing back may not be simple. There is another danger our ancestors faced in different forms, but never at this speed: misinformation. Every society has had rumours, propaganda, superstition, and leaders willing to distort reality. But digital networks can now spread falsehoods across millions of minds before evidence has time to catch up. During a crisis, trust becomes infrastructure. If people cannot agree on what is happening, who has expertise, or which institutions deserve cooperation, then even real solutions become harder to use. So are we approaching a reset? History cannot answer that. It does not offer prophecy. Civilizations are not machines on a fixed timer, and collapse is not fate. The past shows repeated patterns, not guaranteed outcomes. What it gives us is something more useful than prediction: humility. It reminds us that sophisticated societies can be fragile, that abundance can hide dependence, that warning signs are often visible long before the final break, and that the people who survive disruption are rarely the ones who believe disruption is impossible. The question is not whether we are better than Rome, the Maya, or the Bronze Age world. In many ways we clearly are. The question is whether our knowledge, our institutions, and our global connections can make us resilient enough to learn from their failures before we repeat them. Maybe that is the real dividing line, not between civilizations that collapse and civilizations that never do. There may be no such thing as a civilization immune to disruption. Droughts happen, pandemics happen, wars, earthquakes, crop failures, financial panics, political mistakes, volcanic eruptions, and technological accidents happen. No society gets to choose every danger it faces, but societies can choose whether one danger becomes 10. They can choose whether a failed harvest becomes famine, whether a storm becomes permanent displacement, whether a disease outbreak becomes panic, whether a supply shortage becomes a political breakdown. They can build systems that bend under pressure, or systems so rigid that the first hard impact makes them shatter. History suggests resilience begins with something surprisingly simple. Do not put everything in one place. A civilization that depends on one crop, one river, one trade route, one energy source, one financial system, or one central authority may look efficient right up until the moment that single point fails. The Bronze Age kingdoms were powerful because they were connected. But their connections also meant that when trade routes broke, bronze became scarce, armies weakened, palaces lost revenue, and entire regions spiraled downward together. Resilient societies build redundancy, more than one source of food, more than one way to move water, more than one route for essential supplies, seeds stored in different places, local farms alongside global trade, regional energy systems alongside national grids, backup records that do not all depend on the same server, the same company, or the same electrical network. Redundancy can look wasteful during good times. Why maintain extra grain stores when markets are full? Why train people in repair skills when replacement parts can be ordered overnight? Why preserve old tools, local crop varieties, paper maps, or practical knowledge when digital systems work perfectly? Because good times are when resilience is built. By the time the crisis arrives, it is usually too late to invent spare capacity, and food is only the beginning. A society also needs institutions capable of changing course before stress becomes catastrophe. Institutions that can hear bad news without punishing the messenger. Governments that can respond to evidence. Communities that can revise old rules when conditions have changed. Leaders who understand that admitting a problem early is not weakness. It is often the last moment when the problem is still manageable. This is where warning signs matter. The Maya did not wake up one morning and find their cities empty. Their decline unfolded across generations with drought, warfare, political fragmentation, and environmental strain interacting in different ways across different regions. Rome did not collapse in a single night either. Its Western Empire weakened through long sequences of military pressure, economic difficulty, internal conflict, and administrative strain. The final break can seem sudden when we look back. But the pressure usually builds slowly. Water tables fall, soil loses fertility, infrastructure ages, trust erodes. Wealth concentrates, public institutions become less capable. Small emergencies become harder to manage. Experts warn, but the warnings compete with daily life, short-term profit, political rivalry, and the human temptation to believe that tomorrow will resemble yesterday. Then comes the shock. The shock may be a drought, invasion, epidemic, market crash, or storm. But the shock is rarely the whole story. It reveals weaknesses that were already there. That means prevention is not only about predicting the next disaster, it is about reducing fragility before we know which disaster is coming. And that requires knowledge that does not live only in books. A resilient community has people who know how to repair pumps, grow food, preserve harvests, treat water, care for the sick, build shelter, navigate without electronics, and organize fair distribution when supplies are limited. These skills may seem ordinary, but after every collapse in history, ordinary skills became extraordinary assets. So did trust. Trust is what allows neighbours to share food before hunger becomes violence. It allows people to follow evacuation orders, accept medical advice, protect vulnerable families, and work together when normal systems fail. Without trust, every crisis becomes a competition. With it, even damaged societies can recover. Then there is memory. Not nostalgia. Not stories about a perfect golden age that probably never existed. Memory as a survival tool. The memory of floods tells later generations where not to build. The memory of famine preserves seed stores and food traditions. The memory of disease encourages sanitation, quarantine, and public health. The memory of war creates institutions designed, however imperfectly, to prevent the next one. This may be one of civilization's strongest protections, the ability to remember pain without becoming trapped by it, to leave records, to teach children what failed before, to preserve not just the achievements of the past, but its mistakes. Archives, libraries, oral traditions, monuments, scientific databases, and local stories all serve the same purpose. They extend human memory beyond a single lifetime. because every generation is tempted to think it is different. And in some ways it is, but rivers still flood, crops still fail. Systems still become overconfident. Powerful people still ignore inconvenient evidence. And civilizations still discover, often too late, that efficiency is not the same thing as strength. Maybe cycles are not inevitable. Maybe there is no fixed number of civilizations, no cosmic rhythm that says every advanced society must rise, grow arrogant, collapse, and vanish beneath the dust. Maybe the pattern repeats because humans keep making similar choices under similar pressures. And if choices created the pattern, then choices might break it. So, are we the seventh civilization? It is a powerful question. Maybe that is why it stays with people long after the ruins. The flood stories, the buried cities, and the collapsed empires have faded from view. 7 is an ancient number. It appears in religious traditions, mythologies, calendars, and stories from cultures separated by oceans and thousands of years. 7 ages, 7 worlds, 7 times humanity rose, fell, and began again. For some people, these stories preserve a literal memory of earlier global civilizations destroyed by fire, flood, ice, or some catastrophe we have forgotten. It is possible to understand the appeal. We live among the remains of worlds that once seemed permanent. Roman roads still cross Europe. Maya temples rise from forests that grew over abandoned cities. Bronze Age palaces lie beneath layers of ash and rubble. Whole coastlines where people once lived are now deep beneath the sea, drowned when the ice sheets melted and the oceans rose. The past is full of absences, and when we find an absence, the human mind wants to fill it. Maybe there was a civilization before history. Maybe there were many. Maybe the oldest stories are not myths at all, but damaged memories, passed from generation to generation until only a flood, a mountain, a great fire, or a lost golden age remained. But this is where we have to slow down. Mysteries are not proof. A strange artifact, an ancient map, a story that resembles another story from far away. These things can be interesting. They can invite investigation. Sometimes they reveal that historians, archaeologists, and scientists had more to learn. That happens all the time. New sites are found, old dates are revised, entire chapters of the human story become more complicated. But not every mystery points to the same hidden answer. Flood myths may preserve memories of real local disasters, river floods, tsunamis, or rising seas after the last ice age. Or they may reflect a common human experience. People have always lived near water. Water gives life, and water destroys. A flood is one of the most universal disasters a community can imagine. Ruins do not automatically prove a vanished worldwide civilization. Climate records do not automatically reveal a single planetary reset. And the fact that some ancient achievements still surprise us does not mean the people who made them possessed impossible technology. It means ancient people were human, intelligent, patient, organized, creative, and often far more capable than modern people give them credit for. That is the documented reality, and it is astonishing enough. Again and again, societies built complexity. They organized farms, roads, trade routes, irrigation systems, temples, armies, laws, writing, markets, and cities. Again and again, that complexity made life richer for some people and more secure for many others. And again, complexity became fragile. Not because people were foolish. Not because every civilization became corrupt or decadent in exactly the same way. Not because some mysterious force decided their time was up. Usually it was more ordinary than that. A kingdom depended on harvests from one vulnerable region. A city depended on water carried from far away. An empire depended on taxes that could only be collected if trade continued and borders remained secure. A ruling class depended on systems that served it well, even as those systems stopped serving everyone else. Then the pressure arrived. A few dry years, a disease outbreak, a new enemy, a broken trade route, a failed river system, a political struggle at the worst possible moment. None of these had to destroy a civilization on their own. But when a society had lost its spare capacity, when every part depended on every other part working perfectly, one failure could travel through the entire system. That may be the one pattern every reset has in common. Civilizations become most vulnerable when their systems are too interconnected to fail gracefully. Think about it. A connection is usually a strength. Trade brings food to cities. Roads bring medicine. Ships bring materials. Communication spreads knowledge. Shared institutions can coordinate millions of people. The connected world can respond faster, build bigger, and create more than isolated communities ever could. But connection without resilience creates dependency. If food comes from far away, what happens when transport stops? If knowledge exists only in specialized institutions, what happens when those institutions fail? If essential services rely on constant energy, software, finance, and supply chains, what happens when several of those systems break at once? The question is not whether modern civilization is advanced. It obviously is. We possess scientific knowledge, medicine, engineering, communication, and productive capacity beyond anything earlier societies could have imagined. The question is whether advancement has made us resilient, or whether it has made us efficient in ways that only work during stable times. That is not a prophecy. It is not a claim that collapse is inevitable. History does not give us a countdown clock. It does not tell us that we are the seventh civilization, the final civilization, or the next civilization waiting to be erased. But history does offer a warning. No society is too sophisticated to ignore water, soil, disease, climate, energy, inequality, trust, or the limits of its own institutions. No archive is safe if it exists in only one place. No supply chain is secure if it has no alternative. No political system is strong if it cannot recognize reality before reality forces the issue. Maybe the literal lost world theory is true in some form we have not yet discovered. Maybe deep beneath the sea, beneath deserts, forests, and modern cities, there are chapters of human history still waiting to be found. Archaeology will keep searching, science will keep testing. And it should. Curiosity is not the problem. Curiosity is how we learn. But we do not need to prove an unknown global civilization in order to recognize the very real pattern in the civilizations we already know. They rose, they connected, they concentrated knowledge and power. They faced stress. Some adapted, some fractured, some disappeared so completely that later people built new lives on the same ground without knowing who had come before. And then the survivors began again. They carried fragments. A skill, a seed, a story, a tool, a religious memory. A route through the mountains, the knowledge of where the river flooded. The knowledge of how to make fire, store grain, build shelter, raise children, and cooperate with strangers. That is what humanity has always done. We lose things. Sometimes terrible things. But we also preserve things. Perhaps that is the calmer answer to the question. Are we the seventh civilization? Maybe, maybe not. There may be no way to count civilizations cleanly. Civilizations overlap. They inherit from one another. They trade, conquer, merge, fragment, and leave descendants behind. One world does not simply end before another begins. But we are certainly one more civilization standing at the edge between memory and forgetting. And what happens next? may depend less on whether we discover a lost world behind us than on whether we learn from the worlds we can already see. The broken palaces, the drowned villages, the abandoned fields. The libraries burned or scattered, the warnings written in stone, sediment, ice and bone. Preserve knowledge in more than one place. Teach practical skills. Protect the systems that keep people alive. Listen when the evidence is inconvenient. And remember that the past is not only a graveyard of failures, it is also a record of recovery. If you enjoyed this journey through the patterns hidden in history, kindly like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Tell me where you are listening from tonight. It is always fascinating to see how far these old stories travel. And if you would like to support the channel in the best possible way, listen on Spotify. The link is in the description. For now, wherever you are, let the old ruins rest. They have been waiting a very long time to tell us what they know,